To sorrow, in our world it happens that the supreme ruler invariably remains in absolute solitude, regardless of any circumstances. And so, within the walls of the demonic cult, a large-scale invasion of the Orthodox Murim alliance began. Hostile forces had already reached the sacred pavilion of the primordial waters, so the cult defenders threw all their forces to prevent the enemy breakthrough. However, unfortunately, the troops of the Orthodox alliance numbered over 10,000 warriors. They infiltrated literally from everywhere, like an endless stream of ants filling every crevice. Suddenly, one of the commanders noticed the manager of the inner courtyard, who, unlike the others, did not flee along with the other servants. The hurrying young man immediately stopped to respectfully greet the captain of the guard. However, the military leader was horrified when he discovered that there was not a single guard near Jin Emyun, although the young manager was in an extremely dangerous zone. The captain intended to immediately take him to a safe place, but the young man calmly explained that he was heading to the sect leader. It turned out that despite the order for all cult followers to leave the main mountain, the mistress herself had not moved from her place. For all present, the situation was catastrophic. The captain anxiously realized that at this rate the defense lines would fall in less than an hour. Jin Emyun fully understood the seriousness of the situation and ordered the military leader to immediately get to a safe place, and promised that he himself would bring the cult leader as soon as he understood the reason for her delay. At that time, the head of the inner courtyard did not yet suspect that it was already too late to save the ruler. Looking at the fleeing captain through the devastation around, the hero clearly realized that this time the defense plan had completely failed. In the next moment, he quickly ran to the ruler's chambers and introduced himself at the doors as the head of the inner palace, respectfully requesting permission to enter. However, when no answer followed, the young man became much more demanding and simply began to break down the door. Suddenly, the ruler responded, allowing the head to enter. To be honest, Jin Emyun did not even expect her response, especially after such an illiterate address. Therefore, with trembling hands, he began to open the gates, hoping that the empress did not hear his inappropriate tone. The young man hoped that even if she heard, she would understand his despair. After all, from the very beginning he addressed her extremely formally, only then behaving unforgivably boldly. In the end, groaning from the effort, the head began to open the massive door. It turned out to be damn heavy. Apparently the servants responsible for opening the gates had long since fled, so this duty fell on the hero's shoulders. The young man even broke out in a sweat from the tension, but finally the doors gave way and swung open. The ruler almost laughed, because Jin Emyun's martial arts were even worse than those of a third-rate master. Frankly, the young man was at least glad that other elders or captains did not see how he struggled with an ordinary door. The woman herself perfectly understood. If any of the same elders heard how Jin Emyun informally addressed her, the manager would have colossal problems. In the end, the hero's dreams that the ruler had not heard his words were shattered to pieces. However, there was nothing to be done, so approaching closer, he knelt on one knee to respectfully greet the cult leader. Of course, the woman, the 29th leader of the heavenly demonic cult and the great master of the demonic faction, was extremely curious about what the weakest of all the managers of the inner court in her abode had forgotten. Then the young man honestly admitted that he wanted to know why the demon empress Zhongyura still remained here. However, instead of a direct answer, the woman coldly began to list poison that destroys the heavens, poison of bloody slaughter, formless poison, as well as poison that melts bones, and all-consuming poison. All these deadly toxins were simultaneously in her body. It was after these words that Jin Emyun realized the horrifying truth. Most likely, such poisoning could only have been done by that scoundrel, the lord of the demonic faction. This traitor was named Han Mubik. He was the very man whom the cult leader had chosen as her spouse. He also turned out to be the one who opened the gates of the Mountain of 10,000 Peaks for the Murim alliance, becoming the leader of the traitors. It turned out that Zhongyura knew nothing until the very end. Her husband told her everything only before his escape. He also complained that he had to go through incredibly difficult times to get close to her, to win the heart of the former cult leader and then her own. It was Khan Mubek who poisoned the ruler so that she could at least somewhat comprehend the sufferings he had endured. However, to be honest, Jin Emyun could think of this man only as a crazy freak, which he inadvertently voiced aloud. What was surprising was that after his words, Zhongyura smiled, amazed by the young man's fearlessness before her. Moreover, Jin Emyun, apologizing, asked the empress not to embarrass him with such words. In reality, he was astonished that the woman who always looked serious, confident, and invariably strict laughed in the last moments of her life. She also explained that, most likely, the poison that destroys the heavens had already taken over her energy core. Perhaps she could cope with the other poisons, but with this particular poisoning, the ruler could not manage at all. In the end, the hero began to ponder for a long time how he could help in this hopeless situation. After a few minutes, Zhongyura declared that if Jin Emyun mumbled something under his breath even once more, she would simply pull out his tongue as unnecessary. Then the hero admitted that he wanted to know how Zhongyura would act if she had a chance to be reborn. He reminded her that once they had talked about reincarnation in the distant past. Then Jin Emyon said that he had saved the world in his past life. However, to be honest, John Yura found it difficult to believe that someone like the head of the inner court could save an entire world. Moreover, she wished to know why the young man was trying to instill hope in her. After all, if the possibility of reincarnation truly existed, he should have simply minded his own business. However, unfortunately, the hero was not lucky enough to be born a person who cannot tolerate betrayal. Besides that, such help was his way of repaying all the support that Jin Emyon had previously received from Jong Yura. In fact, their first meeting was simply an introduction of his person as one of the candidates for her political marriage. Recalling the long past times, Jong Yura wondered what she would have done in the case of reincarnation. However, unfortunately, the hero understood that the ruler herself would not remember what happened on that day. Despite this, the young man was ready to take on the obligation to eliminate the rotten grain of their clan and the traitor of the cult, so that all the dogs of the Orthodox Murim Alliance, who reinvaded the Mountain of 10,000 Peaks, as well as the external group that caused this incident, would pay for all that was done. For the fulfillment of this plan, the hero was even ready to sacrifice his own soul, although he did not tell Jong Yura this. However, the young man swore that he would exterminate them all to the last one. All he needed was the ruler's answer. If there was something she desired, the hero who returned that day would definitely do everything possible. However, the unexpected demand of the sect leader was that, upon returning to the past, Jin Emyon had to seduce her. However, the surprised hero explained that he could only be sure that he would prevent Khan Mubek from becoming the ruler of the demonic faction. However, he was extremely uncertain about becoming the chosen one for Jong Yura. Obviously, the woman believed that the reason lay in the fact that the hero simply hated her. However, the young man considered winning her heart practically impossible. After all, romantic relationships are those relationships in which both parties desire it. And to be serious, when the young woman was a young cult leader, she was a real tyrant whom no one could stop. She broke the hearts of all the men who approached her, and then mercilessly rejected them. One of the reasons she chose Khan Mubek for the role of the demon faction lord was that he was the only one who could endure her character. Upset by these words, Chon Yura had already changed her mind about the hero fulfilling her request. However, the young man explained that he knows a way to bring the plan to life. Still, after some thought, he realized that romantic relationships begin from the one who is interested towards the one who does not show interest. Therefore, he solemnly promised that he would fulfill her request and win her heart. However, in return, the young man wished that the respected lady would promise him one thing. Even if he speaks sharply about her past, she should not have reproached him. Moreover, if the mistress had any weaknesses, he wished to learn about them immediately. However, the lady immediately warned that if the content of their conversation leaked out, she would kill the manager. Moreover, she would reveal her secret only once, so he had to listen very carefully. In the end, after hearing this, the hero literally trembled, noting to himself that he had never noticed such problems with John Yura before. In her time, she hid everything extremely skillfully. However, unfortunately, they did not have time to talk for long, for the lady felt that their conversation was ending. The invaders had already arrived at the pavilion. All that John Yura could promise was a peaceful death for Jin Emyon, if he wished. However, the manager firmly refused, as he wanted to see everything that would happen until the very end. The leader of the Orthodox Murim Alliance, who was walking ahead of the others, as well as the Supreme Sage, honestly admitted that he did not think he would live to see the fall of the demonic cult in his generation. However, Jin Emyon was enraged that this man marched so boldly, not knowing whom he had on his side. However, the commander introduced the so-called Heavenly Divine Dragon, the one who had endured the leader of the demonic sect for so many years for the victory of the Murim Alliance. To be honest, Jin Emyon was extremely surprised that Han Mubek walked among the Orthodox factions with such a great and majestic title. Han Mubek himself at that moment began mercilessly accusing the demonic empress, believing that it was time for her to pay for her sins. The mistress, however, forced a smile, greeting her beloved husband upon his return. However, the woman perfectly knew his secret. Everything he did was for the society rejecting the heavens. Obviously, all the righteous immediately whispered, trying to comprehend what her words meant. Han Mubayek himself, waving his blade fearfully, called on the alliance leader not to believe the witch's fabrications, as she was trying to drive a wedge between them in the last moments of her life. And indeed, no one wanted to believe the demon's words, especially considering that the mistress's life hung by a thread. So they simply decided to kill her altogether and end their mission there. Honestly, the Empress was disappointed that people thought she had become too weak. After all, even despite the poisoning, she could handle them alone. Of course, the righteous believed that Jong Yura was only lying and reproached her for it. However, the lady cold-bloodedly spread around herself the art of the heavenly demon, severing the heavens, to see what these wretches could oppose to her power. And indeed, the righteous were amazed that she still had so much energy left. Even the leader of the Orthodox Alliance, Muram, panicked, ordering the Golden Dragon Heavenly Sword Squad to attack all at once. Thus, against the whole crowd, the Empress stood shoulder to shoulder next to the hero. However, during the battle, the steward was wounded, causing him to lose consciousness. He recovered quite quickly and witnessed the last moments of Jong Yura's life. She was glad she managed to say goodbye to her servant. The mistress warned that the opponents retreated as soon as she activated the self-destruction array of the pavilion of the Heavenly Water Demon. However, suddenly, turning to her servant, she noticed that he was crying. The young man was truly experiencing unprecedented grief, looking at her condition. At that moment, the lady touched his face for the last time, reminding that the youth was obliged to seduce her. Hearing his promise, she smiled warmly one last time. It was pleasant to bind her fate with such a faithful person in the final moments of life. Immediately after that, due to numerous wounds and swords stuck in her body, the woman fell to the ground. The hero held her body in his arms until the last moment, understanding that these were their final minutes in this life. After all, the temple soon began self-destruction. Thus, the hero had already lived his second life. His first life was not so bad. He was a hero who saved humanity, called the Guardian of the Earth. Thanks to this, the gods granted him 3 privileges, and promised him 2 more reincarnation opportunities. Initially, the youth planned to live the next life in wild revelry. However, in the last moments of his life, he decided to dedicate the next reincarnation to Jong Yura. In the end, the hero woke up at the moment when icy water was splashed in his face. It was the servant who greeted the young master with a wide smile. The man's name was Gu Chil. Moreover, judging by Gu Chil's appearance, Jin Emyun concluded that he had indeed regressed to the past. Besides, the young man wanted to know why the young master needed that icy water. After all, the servant could have just shaken him to wake him up. However, suddenly from the other side of the table, the master who had just given Gu Chil that order responded. And only at that moment did Jin Emyun finally realize exactly when he had regressed. He was 17 years old, the time when he came to the demonic heavenly tower, dreaming of becoming a playboy of the demonic cult. Now his father was outraged that the young heir sneaked to the upper floors and got drunk on the day of the coming-of-age ceremony. And as far as the hero himself remembered his past life, after that the man beat him like a dog and dragged him home. The patriarch himself was now condemning his offspring not only for sneaking and drinking alcohol, but also for passing out from just 1 bottle. And it seemed the young man also embarrassed himself at a party with heirs of other families. Of course, wanting to avoid his father's anger, Jin Emyun immediately jumped up to the patriarch and fell to his knees. Honestly, looking at this scene, Jin Gunaku found it extremely hard to accept that his son was so weak. He hoped that if fate had deprived the heir of strength, it had at least endowed him with intelligence. Therefore, the clan head decided to find out why, according to the young man, he had come to drag him home. Since Jin Emyun in his past life did not answer this question correctly, which led to the beating, now he assumed that the reason for the patriarch's visit was his upcoming meeting with the young cult leader. This event would soon be called the Marriage Assembly, where the 17-year-old cult leader Jong Yura would meet with the elite heirs of the 6 great clans. Essentially, it was a contest to determine the future spouse for the cult leader. However, during the last event, no one was elected, and at the tournament to choose the ruler of the demonic faction, the traitor Khan Mubek won. Moreover, the hero could not allow a repetition of the events of the past at any cost. Jin Gunak himself explained to his son that the only reason he, a talentless and unmotivated person, was allowed to live was precisely this moment. The hero was not at all surprised to hear these words, for Jin Gunak was a ruthless father who would not hesitate to use even his own child for the glory of his clan. At that very moment, the head of the family wished to know if his offspring could win the heart of the leader and rise above the other heirs. However, the manager confidently stated that the other heirs of the 6 great clans were not even worthy of the mistress, and the father was quite satisfied with this answer. He also warned that if Jin Emyun did not want to disgrace their name, he must immediately go and practice his self-defense martial arts. Finally, after the patriarch left, the young man sighed with relief, not expecting to encounter a man immediately after waking up. And yet reincarnating 20 years back was the best he could hope for. And now the hero had many more opportunities. Moreover, probably at this time the society rejecting the heavens was also active. This meant that Jin Emyun must have the strength to destroy them at the root. At that moment, the frightened Gu Chil ran to him swiftly, as he did not understand what his young master was planning. Earlier, under the patriarch, the young man boldly declared that he would become the future husband of the young cult leader. However, to be honest, the servant could not recall when the heir had said something like that. Gu Chil had no idea what the young master was claiming, since under the patriarch he had said something completely different. However, Jin Emyun noted that he had never heard a statement from him that he would become the husband of the young cult leader. All he said was that the other contenders would be rejected by her. Of course, in Gu Chil's mind, it was practically the same thing, but the manager knew that these were completely different concepts. John Yura of that time was impossible to conquer at all, no matter what. She was obsessed with the idea of perfecting martial arts and paid no attention to those who were weaker. Most likely, he would be rejected as well. However, a young man who suddenly approached from behind the hero was outraged that the heir of the Jin clan was still here. The hero, honestly, looked at the young man with surprise. He was the second son of the demonic Blood Dragon clan. His name was Ma Chulso. Therefore, the hero decided to ask the second master where he had put Yunhee and why he came alone. However, the malicious guy reminded him that he did not have a younger sister with that name, and did not understand why the hero always said such nonsense when they met. In the end, unable to endure it, the young man decided to challenge Jin Emyun to a duel. And surprisingly, in the hero's past life, nothing like this had happened. Probably the reason was that the patriarch neither beat him nor dragged him back home, so unexpected events were happening now. As is known, the clans ruling together with the cult of the Heavenly Demon and the Jun clan are called the 6 demonic clans. Among them were the demonic Heavenly Jin clan and the Blood Dragon clan, and their relations were exceptionally bad. Of course, Jin Emyun reminded Ma Chulso that personal conflicts between clans were technically forbidden. However, Ma Chulso was well aware of the exceptions. Moreover, the hero understood that since this was not about the survival of a clan and it was an unofficial duel, it must concern the ruling Jun clan. Therefore, he expressed his assumption to the young lord, and the latter quickly confirmed it. It turned out that the young man insisted that the hero fight him, and in case of losing this duel, he refused to meet with the young leader of the cult. However, the hero was surprised that the heir of the Ma clan came to him with such a demand, considering that his younger brother, not himself, would participate in the meeting. Therefore, Jin Emyun wanted to know why he should agree to this absurd contest. He even suggested that perhaps Ma Chulso's younger brother was too weak, since he needed to arrange duels in the shadows. He also asked the young man not to go too far, as this could escalate into a full-scale conflict between their clans. Nevertheless, the enraged heir rushed at the hero to fight, believing that Jin Emyun had no right to underestimate him. Obviously, when he charged with his blade at the young lord, Gu Chil had already grabbed his sword. However, the servant remembered the hero's warning. No matter what happened, he must not intervene. The time had come to use his first privilege. The hero could occasionally awaken his senses based on his life before the previous one. Of course, Gu Chil panicked, knowing that his young master did not know martial arts and was trying to confront this young man. However, the whole point was that with awakened senses, even if he could not match the skill of Ma Chulso's father, the hero could withstand the teenager's technique. He literally saw all of the young man's movements, easily blocked his strikes with just his fingers, and intended to defeat him. Of course, Gu Chil was in colossal shock when his ward performed the impeccable turn stance. Immediately after that, the hero also struck the young man, aiming straight at his dignity and his pants. In the end, the opponent fell to the ground, coughing from pain, while the servant tried to comprehend how it happened that the young man who was carefree and inexperienced in martial arts just yesterday suddenly defeated an experienced fighter. However, without explaining anything, Jin Yamyung immediately ordered those hiding now in the shadows, guarding Ma Chulso, to appear before him and take their master away. Looking at this scene, the heir of the Jin clan perfectly understood how furious Ma Chulso would be once he woke up. However, his warriors had to stop their master from foolishness, otherwise the hero would publicly declare that Ma Chulso was a talentless man who lost to him. However, he also warned that he only slightly damaged his dignity in his pants, as he restrained his strength, so he asked not to escalate this conflict. Still, if it became known that the Jin clan crippled the heir of the Ma clan, it would be a disaster. He could not allow that. Soon, having finished all his affairs, the young man finally returned home, where everyone lined up, greeting the young master. Immediately, the elderly manager who came out decided to find out if Jin Emyun enjoyed the trip with friends. However, the hero found it difficult to answer this question. His thoughts were occupied by his father, who had made the entire way to the training hall to personally bring him home. And the chief steward, managing all the clan's affairs, definitely knew about this. Of course, the heir immediately noted that the old man could sometimes be extremely cheeky. However, he excused himself by saying that he was simply worried about the young master's well-being. In the end, ignoring his excuses, Jin Emyun ordered to give him access to the training hall. And of course, the head was amazed that the young man was going to train in martial arts. Even all the clan's students were astonished to hear these words. However, ignoring their views, Jin Emyun ordered several scrolls with special martial arts to be brought to him from the clan archive. Immediately after these words, the hero remembered his past. Back then, when he was drinking, they brought him these very special arts, promising that by mastering them, he would become invincible. However, the young man did not want to study from these books, as they were not even complete versions, but only excerpts of martial arts. However, for some reason, the elders continued to force him to study and blamed him for the fire that occurred in the main estate. He remembered that back then the teacher, with whom the heir discussed this, was convinced that the martial art had no chance to shine simply because it fell into the hands of the Jin clan. and these are people who rely solely on brute force. Remembering this, the young man realized that the fire must occur in about 4 years. For this reason, the scrolls in his hands were untouched now. It was the divine art of soaring in the heavens and the art of the 10 fangs of the demon. As is known, the techniques of the Jin clan focus on palm and foot strikes, which was not quite in the style of the hero himself. Nevertheless, he possessed an exceptional innate talent, outstanding perception, and a solid foundation of inner energy. Of course, it was possible that the young man would never meet his master in this life, but he swore to become the great one his mentor had always dreamed of. He still remembered the promise made to the cult leader. However, he believed he would not be able to keep it and seduce the mistress, since at his current level she would reject him anyway. For at least 5 years, the head planned to isolate himself and devote himself to martial arts. After that, he would increase his strength and then be able to find and destroy those degenerates from the society rejecting the heavens. Also that on the day Cheon Yura became the cult leader, at least her rule would be unthreatened. Suddenly, when he recalled her expression at the moment he made the promise, the young man twitched. In the end, he was filled with determination. He would do everything in his power to avoid a repeat of that horror. 2 weeks later, they went out on business together with Gu Chil, who was extremely worried that the young master was in no hurry at all. However, it was a meeting with the young sect leader, and the hero saw no point in rushing to meet where he would be rejected anyway. Of course, Gu Chil thought the young man still should not treat the event so lightly. However, he promised to deal with his father's anger on his own later. He remembered that last time, when he failed all the events, his father locked him in the house for a year. Moreover, he announced that the hero could no longer claim the role of his heir. However, in this case, for Jin Emyun, it was only a joy since he was going to train in isolation for 5 years anyway. However, unexpectedly, before they reached the gates, some young master suddenly flew out from there. The hero only laughed at such an aggressive greeting, while Gu Chil realized that apparently someone had been expelled from the participants. Looking at the red battle mantle and the sword of the bloody blade, one could conclude that this was a young man from the Blood Dragon clan. At that very moment, the approaching Jung Yura was convinced. This guy was really completely useless. However, when she suggested he continue the fight, he immediately got up and ran towards the young cult leader. Then the hero understood. It was definitely this woman. He turned to her, and she was as beautiful in youth as in her more mature years. However, her cruelty remained the same. Honestly, Jin Emyun even felt a little uneasy that he was not late for this meeting. But since they had no choice, he suggested Gu Chil go inside to enjoy the spectacle. As far as the hero remembered from his past life, the young man from the Ma clan was expelled from the race for Jong Yura's hand after he lost consciousness from a single blow by the young leader. However, now something was clearly wrong, because he rushed into battle again with full determination, although he had just been thrown out, breaking the door with his body. Jong Yura herself was surprised that this guy turned out to be better than she expected. Therefore, the hero only wondered, was the youngest son of the clan always this strong? In the end, of course, the young man still lost when the girl struck his palm with the backside of the sword, causing the blade to fly out of his hands. However, despite the shameful defeat, he immediately began blaming Jin Emyun for his loss, brazenly poking him with his finger. He also loudly shouted that he would never lose to a person like him. Right after that, the younger son of the Ma clan thanked the young leader of the cult for the fight. And of course, Jeon Yura hoped that the young man would become stronger in the next encounter. She also smiled and suggested that he go to the Mercy Hall to treat his wounds, and he shyly thanked the beauty for her kindness. Honestly, the hero had no idea what was going on, especially regarding the anger of the younger son of the Ma clan, since they were meeting for the first time in this life. Moreover, the young man had not even been refused. At that very moment, Jeon Yura calmly approached the hero, explaining that she had been waiting for him. She could say that the guy she had just fought had quite decent strength, and if Jin Emyun managed to defeat his older brother, then surely the young man himself was even stronger. Therefore, the young leader very much hoped that the hero would meet her expectations, and warned that if Jin Emyun did not do so, she would be truly very disappointed. In the end, they engaged in battle. This was exactly the main problem of the demonic cult, because here everything was tried to be solved by brute force. Moreover, the girl showed no mercy to him, aiming the blade straight at his head. It was supposed to be a friendly duel, but it felt as if Jeon Yura was trying to kill him. He wanted to know why she immediately went into battle, starting with a deadly move. It seemed that in a duel with the youngest of the Ma family, she was much more tolerant. In the end, once again, when he dodged the attacks, the words that escaped his mouth were that he called Jeon Yura crazy. Honestly, the young leader was quite offended by these words. Jin Emyun immediately realized his mistake and promptly tried to apologize to her. However, the girl was so enraged that she decided to show the hero what the blade of the crazy one was really capable of. In the end, the hero realized all he needed was to defend against the attacks. He would just take a few hits, otherwise the fight would not end. However, the girl quickly understood that in this battle Jin Emyun was simply hiding his true strength. At that moment, she used the sword's aura, literally forcing the opponent to act. Before this, in a fight with the predecessor, she simply parried blows with an ordinary blade. However, against the hero, she decided to use not only deadly moves, but also the sword's aura. In the end, she managed to attack the young man and push him away, causing him to crash into the wall with his back and immediately cough. Chonyura was clearly disappointed that the youth tried to simulate a passive fight and hid his strength. Therefore, she warned that he better stop these childish games and show the power he possessed. However, the hero hastened to explain that he had never fought insincerely. The lady, of course, was furious, believing that this petty bastard had decided to remain ignorant until the very end. However, the young man was not lying. He had never been insincere. His sincerity was simply not aimed at winning this duel. But Chonyura did not understand this. Therefore, she warned that if the hero really tried to deceive her, she would simply kill him, as he wished. She intended to create an attack that, if Jin Emyun did not defend against it, would truly kill him. It was the technique of the 6 strikes of the Phantom Demon, the sword art of the demon that cuts the heavens. The hero, of course, hastened to defend himself, using the Divine Fang sword art, specifically, the first Heavenly Fang. Fortunately, he managed to block the strike, and the young man miraculously survived because the blade barely touched his face. Looking at his trembling hands, the hero himself could not believe his luck. He blocked the strike. However, Chonyura smiled and made it clear that this was far from over. Honestly, the hero was amazed that the girl at 18 already knew how to use an enhanced aura. He knew that Chonyura had already surpassed the peak zone for her age. However, despite his knowledge, her power was truly madness. So, when she aimed at his neck, the hero only closed his eyes, letting her kill him. However, to his surprise, he felt no pain and was still alive. The patriarch intervened, realizing that his daughter had clearly lost control, and seemed to plan to destroy the entire cult's support with her strike. Everyone immediately bowed to greet the man. After all, it was the heavenly demon who had deigned to descend to them. The hero knelt and paid respect to the true supreme representative of the divine cult. The leader himself warned his daughter. With her behavior, she had almost started a civil war within the cult. As is known, in the more than 2,000-year history of the cult, this man was the 3rd person to receive the title of supreme. Moreover, he was the 28th leader of the divine cult of the Heavenly Water Demon, and the acting master of the demonic faction. His name was Heavenly Demon Jian Taizhong, and now he warned his daughter that if the Jian clan and the Jin clan started a civil war, their supporting factions would join the opposing sides. And while the cult's forces were weakened, the Orthodox Alliance would have pounced on them as if it were the perfect moment to strike. And although the words of the Heavenly Water Demon were somewhat exaggerated, the hero still agreed. The Heavenly Lord was right. Of course, the young cult leader could not have been unaware of this. However, his father, the king of the Asuras, Jingunak, would never have started a civil war just because a child he had long abandoned died. In the end, the heavenly demon demanded that his daughter apologize for her behavior. And with a hateful glance, the mistress did apologize, while the hero quickly stood up to smooth over the conflict. However, to be honest, he never would have thought he would live to see the moment when the heartless demon empress was forced to apologize to anyone. After all, this was the divine cult of the heavenly demon, where only the strongest survived, and the strongest was precisely the Zhong clan. Next came the 6 great clans, and then the ordinary followers. At that moment, the heavenly demon, looking at the young man, realized that the Jin clan had raised a worthy heir, who in his opinion was the hero. And immediately the young man remembered the laws of the divine cult of the heavenly demons. For according to the laws, the patriarch or heir of the 6 great clans cannot become a partner of the young leader and the next cult leader. Therefore, the hero had to explain that his qualifications were deemed insufficient, so his younger brother was chosen as the clan's heir. To be honest, the heavenly demon was surprised to hear something like that, since the boy had clearly used the sword aura at the moment of deflecting the attack right before his eyes. The Lord could swear that the young man's qualifications were quite sufficient for his position. However, he claimed that he was not the heir of his clan. He had come here only to fulfill his duty as a man of the Jin clan. However, the patriarch warned the young man that he must fulfill his duty to the end. Immediately after that, he left, promising that when the next meeting was scheduled, they would definitely inform the Jin clan about it. He very much hoped to catch the moment when Jin Emyun would still manage to get along with his dear daughter. However, Jin Emyun did not respond to this assumption because he thought completely differently. But of course, under the piercing gaze, he had to swear that he would do everything in his power, although in his heart he realized, if he got involved with Chonyura during this period, it would be the end for him. In the end, the heavenly demon went about his business, realizing that the Jin clan had raised such a worthy heir that he even wanted to meet Jinguan and have a glass of wine. And along with these thoughts, all the hero's plans were thrown into the trash. After the heavenly demon left, Chonyura admitted that she would not apologize for her action, because she believed that Jin Emyun was to blame for deceiving her. She perfectly understood that Jin Emyun hated her. Probably that was why he deceived her. And also she apologized for the cult leader's order, as she well knew that the hero was not happy about it at all. However, Jin Emyun hastened to calm Jeon Yura. He did not hate her at all. Recalling his past life, he could say that she actually liked him very much. However, after the words slipped out, he tried to explain that he liked her not in a romantic sense. He simply admired her and hoped that she would understand his intentions correctly. Moreover, his actions today had nothing to do with her, so he hoped that the young leader held no grudge against him. However, Jeon Yura instantly stopped the young man, reminding him that they were both equals, and he did not need to belittle himself by calling her the eternally young cult leader. So they both paused, thinking about how the hero could address the girl. The bright idea came first to Jin Emyun, so he smiled and suggested that from now on they should address the girl as Lady Jeon Yura. And it seemed she liked this form of address. While they were returning home, Gu Chil continuously praised his young master. He was behaving truly incredibly. Moreover, the servant was glad that the patriarch would be delighted with his actions. However, he regretted that the young man would not be able to have solitude because of this. In any case, the main thing was that the young master had earned the recognition of the heavenly water demon himself. However, the hero was not amused at all. He was sad that his isolated training had been spoiled. However, unexpectedly upon the hero's return, the young man was met by his younger brother. He came because he heard that the younger one had been practicing in the training room before going to the Hall of the Junior Demons. He was worried that his older brother was now aiming for the role of heir to the Jin clan. Of course, the young man reminded him that there were laws. However, the elder, more than anyone else, knew that the relationship with the young cult leader could be resolved at any time. It was not an obstacle to holding the position. After that, he bluntly admitted that he did not recognize Jin Emyun as his brother. And honestly, the young man was unexpectedly harsh towards the hero. He even stated that Jin Emyun had no place in the Jin clan. However, Gu Chil hastened to calm the heir, for he was going too far. After all, their young master had achieved colossal accomplishments at the meeting. However, the second brother was extremely disappointed that someone like a former assassin dared to engage in a discussion between the direct descendants of the Jin clan. In the end, Gu Chil had to fall silent along with the old steward and hide behind the hero's back. Jin Emyun himself was shocked that some 16-year-old teenager allowed himself to say such things. It irritated him immensely. In the end, he realized, it seemed he would have to correct the rotten attitude of his younger brother so that disrespect for their own clan would not drag him down in the future. His younger brother, who would become the patriarch in the future, must learn to respect him. And now, thinking about this, the hero remembered that before this, he and his brother had never fought. Whereas in other clans, brothers and sisters fight until they establish a strong bond. In the end, the younger brother attacked. Moreover, he was very angry that Jin Emyun kept running away from him like a rat. However, Jin Emyun reminded him that it was the younger brother's problem since he couldn't land a single hit on him. Therefore, enraged, the young man swore that no matter what it cost him, he would definitely injure Jin Emyun. And he used the triple crushing strike enhanced with internal energy. Jin Emyun was outraged that the younger brother dared to say such terrible things to the elder, whom he was supposed to respect. Moreover, he reminded him, he had challenged the younger brother to a duel for 3 obvious reasons. First, he was chosen as one of the 6 demon dragons, but there is always someone stronger. Second, he dared to insult the honor of the Jin clan, which he would one day lead. While they fought, everyone watched with admiration the first young lord. He had changed a lot, although he had previously been a complete idler. Moreover, everyone was amazed that the second young lord, as well as the demon dragon, were clearly losing in this fight. In the end, beaten, soon he was kneeling and apologizing to the older brother, promising to remember his advice, but also promising that next time he would become stronger to defeat him. However, Jin Emyun ordered his brother not to rush, for he had not yet revealed his final reason for this fight. The very last reason to punish the little brother was that he did not know how to properly show due respect to his elder brother. At that moment, he released the aura of the sword. Frightened by this, the second brother and heir immediately began to assure that he had not properly expressed his boundless admiration for his brother. However, Jin Emyun still continued to beat him, believing that etiquette towards elders should be shown not only in words. Soon Jin Emyun came to the patriarch, who praised the young man for having done personal work. Moreover, the cult leader had not stopped praising the young man until now. He even praised the boy's father for the competence with which he raised such a talented groom for his daughter, and the man no longer knew how to perceive it. So he was worried that the hero intended to become the heir. However, the young man believed that this position should be given to his younger brother. Unlike the hero himself, he constantly proved his worth to their clan, and the hero intended to serve alongside the young cult leader and elevate the clan's prestige. And honestly, Jin Gunak was surprised. He would never have thought that the son valued the honor of their clan so highly. However, Jin Emyun was confident that while other clans wasted their potential fighting over heirs, he and the younger one could build a solid foundation both inside and outside. Then the next generation of the Jin clan would be called the greatest among the 6 great clans. The idea voiced by the heir was indeed very good, so Jin Gunak was curious whether the hero could bring it to life. Hearing the affirmative answer, he believed the young man. Lately he had become impressive, and as a father he had to support him. Therefore, the man decided to find out if there was something the young man wanted to obtain. Soon Jin Emyun went for a walk around the city, for he understood perfectly well, since the pavilion was closed and training was cancelled. It was time to start digging into the shadow organizations behind all the cult's troubles. As is known, the rule of the current heavenly demon, the acting sect leader, was incredibly strong, so these scoundrels must have been acting covertly for now. However, John Yura was in a completely different situation. Among the branches of her clan, there were many talented peers, so there were disagreements about whom exactly to support. The young man decided that from now on everything he researched could become the very trump card that in the future could pressure the young cult leader. Moreover, Jin Emyun was extremely curious why the younger brother always followed him closely. It turned out that the heir was simply incredibly curious about what the hero had been doing lately to become so powerful. In the end, the young man had no choice, so they set off together towards the black market. The second brother was extremely surprised. The black market is a place for buying and selling illegal goods, as well as a refuge where heretics and those who broke clan laws gather. However, Jin Emyun asked his brother to remember only one thing. In the mountain of 10,000 peaks, the word illegal practically did not exist. There was simply no benefit in ordinary sect followers knowing certain things, so they were appropriately concealed. Simply put, the black market was under the influence of one of the 6 great clans, and the place they were heading to was engaged in gathering intelligence. However, what was astonishing was that this abode looked exactly as the hero remembered it from when he was the manager. It turned out to be the hidden golden pavilion. As soon as the young man opened the gates and they entered, many people in black robes appeared behind the doors, controlling this black market. They immediately bowed and greeted the honored guests from the Jin clan and wished to know what brought them to this place. However, the hero made it clear that they had brought no information to proudly share. Therefore, he demanded that the chief be brought to him immediately, with whom he could negotiate. The man immediately introduced himself as the chief manager of this place. He was the demon of the Golden Raven. However, Jin Emyun believed that in order to negotiate with the eldest son of the Jin clan, at least someone equally worthy from the clan should appear. Naturally, the manager was extremely curious about how the young man knew about this. However, the youth smiled and explained that it was not so difficult to find out about the reconnaissance unit of the SA clan from the Black Dragon. When Jin Emyun told him this, the manager was already extremely enraged and wanted to know how the eldest son knew this. However, for such insolence, the hero also rewarded him with a slap. After all, although he did not know how to respect elders, he certainly knew how to beat. Moreover, the young man was surprised that a simple representative of the Sei clan dared to express murderous intentions towards him, and even drew a weapon that was hidden in his sleeve. Finally, a lady appeared at the shouts from outside, who asked to stop the disputes. And Jin Emyun already greeted the lady with a smile. She was a direct descendant of those clans that managed the black market, and the fact that the Golden Pavilion was under her leadership was known to few even inside the clan. Therefore, it was obvious that the woman considered the Jin clan's intelligence-gathering abilities to be higher than she expected. Also, a side job of this woman was a servant of the young cult leader, whom they had already met earlier during a battle. She was also the very lady who lent her powers to Jin Emyun during his duel with Jong Yura. Now she decided to find out what had brought the first heir here. However, the youth explained that recently something strange was happening in the red light district and alleys. They seemed to think that a disease with black spots had appeared there. Obviously, everyone was surprised that the young man was aware of this. However, the hero calmly explained that the talkative fool from the Star House of Courtesans kept repeating only this. As is known, the disease with black spots is a strong drug that was about to start infecting the entire cult from within. If we assume that these plans had been ongoing for some time, then the infection with black spots must be part of someone's sinister scheme. In the end, the woman admitted that this disease definitely came to them from outside the cult, and even with the full support of their main clan, they could not trace its origin. At least they did not suspect that it was the work of subordinate branches of one of the 6 great clans. However, the hero was extremely disappointed by this information, as he expected more from the SA clan's intelligence network. The young man was already about to leave, but when the woman asked Jin Emyun to stay, he turned to her with a smile. In the end, they reached an agreement that the young man would help resolve this issue quietly. Then she would hand over all the collected information to him. The lady promised to appoint someone from the SA clan to oversee this matter, and the hero smiled and promised to take full responsibility for resolving this situation. After that, the heroes, together with the brother, immediately hurried to leave, and the girl hastily informed the young cult leader that these two had finally left. No one suspected that John Yura knew everything that was happening and was watching the scene from the terrace. Not long ago, John Yura was walking with her father, and then he admitted that, watching the fight between the heiress and the hero, he realized Jin Emyun himself did not realize at what moment he began to fully invest himself in the battle. Of course, the daughter assumed that the hero was serious in the duel. But the matter was different. Jin Emyun's gaze at that moment was not fixed on the sword or the victory. He was looking only at young Yura herself. Obviously, the lady was angry at herself, because, having heard such words from her father, she herself involuntarily began to look at the young man in a completely different way. At that moment, the hero himself went to the Unru Valley, the southernmost, and at the same time hidden and hard-to-reach valley of the divine cult of the heavenly demon. Even most clans avoided it. It is truly a lawless zone. However, the young man was not worried at all because, as is known, when you want to catch a tiger, a person must enter its lair. Although the information agent of the SA clan under the name Black Dagger was worried that by taking such risks, they would simply be eaten alive. The hero only smiled, warning Black Dagger that he would immediately go to his lady and tell her about his cowardly words if he did not calm down right now. In the end, Black Dagger apologized, and they continued on their way. However, the guy still could not believe that they would be able to get any information in such a place. And Jin Emyun asked Dagger to carefully observe his actions, because he knew that it was sometimes easiest to find information in such places. They continued their journey through the backwoods when suddenly the hero felt someone's intense gaze on him. They were clearly being followed, and he swore to deal with this person if he did not detach from them soon. Soon they found themselves in a picturesque field where exquisite red flowers grew. Black Dagger thought that these flowers definitely had their own charm, and he was pleased that even though the local people were exiles, they grew such things that gave peace of mind. However, the hero hastened to explain that these flowers were used to make forbidden substances. Moreover, it was clearly not the fieldworkers who were involved, but most likely a whole gang. But suddenly the path ahead was blocked for the guys by a bunch of armed poor men, who warned that entry beyond this point was forbidden for them. If they did not want to suffer, it was better for them to turn around and leave their territory. However, Jin Emyun was not at all frightened by their warnings, because except for the guy in the center, the others turned out to be petty bandits. Therefore, the young man, unafraid, demanded to meet with the leader. The beggar just laughed, for he was going to let this aristocrat go, since he looked like some noble person of the cult. But it seemed the youth was literally asking for a beating. So the leader sent his guys into battle, ordering them to break the hero's arm or do something else to teach him a proper lesson. At that very moment, the frightened Black Dagger explained that he specialized in preemptive strike tactics. He was not a fighter, and Jin Emyun did not expect him to do anything in such a situation, so he calmly warned the agent if he died here, he would have colossal problems. At the same time, while in his chambers, the second brother guessed why Jin Emyun lied about going to the courtesan's house. Moreover, he even invented a name for a girl who never existed. Soon, having dealt with everyone, Jin Emyun reached the very leader, who was truly surprised by what he saw. He would never have thought that his servant would bring guests to him, and the beaten young man could only apologize to the third elder. However, for the old man himself, meeting the noble gentleman of one of the 6 great clans was an enormous honor. However, Jin Emyun wished for the man to guess exactly which clan he belonged to. If he guessed correctly, the hero would even provide a generous reward on behalf of their clan. Indeed, the elder knew perfectly well that the 6 clans were associated with wealth and influence. Moreover, he concluded that the young man belonged to the Se clan, which hides in the shadows. If you think about it, their suppliers were the Huan clan, while the SA clan, hidden in the shadows for generations, was at odds with the Huan clan. This was exactly the information Jin Emyun wanted to fish out of the man. But in the end, the young man explained to him that he was mistaken and gave his real name. Only then did the old man realize that before him stood the first son of the heavenly demon clan, and also a young leader, although he was surprised by his modest physique. And the agent was worried that Jin Emyun had so easily revealed his identity. These people could have been those who supplied the disease with black spots. However, the young man was not worried, for then they could simply crush them with the power of their clan. In the end, bowing, the elder decided to find out what had brought the noble gentleman from the Jin family to such humble lands. The hero honestly reported that he was interested in the incidents involving the disease with black spots. He had heard rumors that the source of this drug was right here, so he wished to learn a little more about it. The man immediately tried to somehow justify himself, and the young man decided to help loosen his tongue by handing him a pouch of coins. When the old man opened it, he realized it was completely filled with gold to the very edges. Therefore, he hurried to explain that the disease with black spots was a product coming from outside, and although it passed through this area, their hands did not touch it. Everything they were responsible for was the delivery of drugs to the Huan clan. They did not distribute them either in the red light district or on the streets. Of course, Jin Emyun wanted to know who, in that case, was engaged in their distribution. The elder immediately named the younger sect of the tyrannical heavens as the culprit, but suddenly another worried servant ran up to the elder. Running past the guests, he immediately informed the elder about the arrival of strangers. This stranger turned out to be the young leader of the cult, who by that time had dealt with all the homeless people she saw before her. Shortly before this, while a man was resting, a worried servant ran to him, reporting the appearance of the young cult leader. Of course, the man, a member of the Alliance spy squad, thought that his friend had drunk early in the morning, so he was talking nonsense. However, it was by no means nonsense. The arrived John Yura had already defeated about 10 guys who stood in her way in one fell swoop, so she overcame the guys from the poisonous snail sect. In the end, the man quickly realized, even if they were mistaken, and it was not John Yura at all, this girl was in any case one of the important bigwigs of the 6 clans. As is known, besides the young leader, there were several other female persons possessing similar power. There was a girl from the So clan, a leader from the Se clan, and also the twins from the Pyong clan. However, it was obvious that this could definitely not be the cult leader, whom they had been actively hunting all the time. The Alliance spy had no choice left, so he ordered his assistant to immediately gather the guys. The latter went to summon the members of the 17th Spy Squad. However, it was about others. They needed the squad of deadly demons, who were assigned from above to ensure the continuous flow of the disease with black spots. A squad of powerful killers. It turned out that all this time, when Jin Emyun felt observers behind him, it was precisely Lady John Yura. Then the assistant who came with her warned the girl that if they got too close, they would become involved. However, the future Empress could not help but watch the hero, because a large-scale drug plantation was happening around, and their cult was leaving this place unattended. As was known to the servant of the young leader, this location was a necessary base for the development of the Huang clan. Moreover, by leaving this place unprotected, they wanted to attract external enemies in order to easily deal with them. But honestly, John Yura could not believe that Jin Emyun came here knowing this fact in advance. Therefore, there was no choice. She ordered her subordinates to continue the investigation. All she wanted was to find out what this guy was really thinking. Besides, the ruler had previously said that since John Yura, by definition, had many enemies, she needed to learn to distinguish friends from foes. Hearing these words, the subordinates were even slightly touched that their mistress was so concerned about her leadership qualities. However, in reality, the woman understood that her main enemy might be among the recluses in this place. It was an excellent chance to get revenge on him. Therefore, she immediately rushed forward, leading her assassins behind her. However, to her great bewilderment, she defeated everyone but did not find a single recluse. And what was even stranger was that Jin Emyun passed here without any resistance, while she was constantly hindered by someone. Finally, when the hero joined the young mistress leader, he realized whose gaze he had felt on himself then, but still decided to help, offering to continue the path together. However, at that moment, a squad of demonic assassins had already appeared to them. Honestly, the spies were surprised that the report about John Yura's arrival here turned out to be true. The leader of the spy squad himself hurried to apologize to the young cult leader for the fact that she would have to become a hostage in their hands. The spy even refused to introduce himself to the girl, only warning that for her own good, it would be better if she simply followed them peacefully. Of course, frightened, the third elder, along with his servants, hurried to bow and leave, not wanting to suffer in this conflict. And John Yura, analyzing the enemy, realized that he was very similar to a beggar from the poor clan of the Murim Alliance. Therefore, Jin Emyun immediately suggested torturing this scoundrel. Perhaps a lot of information could be extracted from him. After that, John Yura turned to all her assassins behind her and asked them for help. She also separately asked for assistance from the mistress of the Se clan. And with a smile, she fulfilled this request, ordering the Black Butterfly Squad to protect the young master and mistress to the end. In the end, the assassins hiding in the shadows immediately surrounded the young man, and Jin Emyun was struck by his own inattentiveness. For the very black dagger who had been traveling with him all along was actually the heiress of the Se family. The warrior of the beggars sect himself only laughed at the pathetic strategy of these two. However, he noted that none of those accompanying the young cult leader had even reached the level of peak. On their side, there were many outstanding masters at the peak of their abilities. Honestly, John Yura was surprised that the man knew so much about their cult, but he considered it unsurprising, given that it concerned the Zhong family. However, such contemptuous words insanely enraged the mistress. Therefore, now for her, the enemy was no more than a pathetic insect. Releasing the aura of her chi, she warned these mice that none of them would leave the mountain of 10,000 peaks alive. After that, the girl rushed into battle against these supposedly great masters, cutting them down one by one. She even managed to laugh at these insignificant creatures who could not even properly attack her. Soon her opponents realized that they could not continue this duel any longer. But at the same time, they did not want to die either. In the end, the only way out for them, to at least die with honor, was to target the hero who stood surrounded by assassins nearby. The warrior with the axe rushed at him, flying past the young cult leader, and was clearly determined to kill him. And Jin Emyun, to be honest, was surprised that the guy attacked so recklessly, as if he did not see the guards surrounding him. But the most surprising thing was that at the moment he was attacked, all the defenders immediately scattered to the corners, as if clearing the way to the hero himself. Unfortunately, it was already too late to run, because the opponent, although not the best, was still a high-class martial arts master. Therefore, armed with his blade at the last moment, the young man defended himself from the axe attack. But the force of the blow was still so impressive that the hero was thrown back. Moreover, this was exactly the moment when he wanted to show himself at his best. The assassins themselves were extremely surprised that Jin Emyun managed to block the strike of the master rushing at him. Even the master himself had no idea how the young man did not die. And the hero was amazed at how this foolish bastard dared to say such things to him. However, he really could not hide his surprise, because according to his calculations, the opponent should have died from a fractured skull. At that very moment, approaching the mercenary from behind, John Yura easily cut off his head, simultaneously making sure that the hero was capable of withstanding even this fighter's attack. To be honest, the guy was surprised that this was another test arranged by the young cult leader. He could only hope that the lady was at least satisfied with the confirmation of his abilities. Unfortunately for him, he could not show anger, because conducting such trials was not uncommon among high-ranking persons. And yet he cursed the cult of the heavenly demon for this. Soon they captured a member of the poor sect, leaving him alive for the possibility of torture. Of course, he prayed for death, but the girl saw no point in killing him, for he knew about the disease with black spots, and therefore was useful to them. Of course, the poor man immediately started swearing, trying to make it clear that he knew absolutely nothing about any disease. However, at that moment, the hero was so enraged by this lie that he became certain he had truly become a demonic follower, considering he had lived 2 lives in a demonic clan. Although he usually did not take martial arts seriously, he learned a couple of techniques that interested him. In particular, he learned a grip that tears tendons and bones and studied it thoroughly as a method of torture. Therefore, the young man asked the poor man to remain silent. In that case, Jin Emyun would practice on him, as he was very eager to have fun with his new friend. In the end, while the hero tortured the poor man, John Yura apologized to the lady for causing extra trouble when she asked to put the hero in harm's way. However, the lady was not worried, considering that Jin Emyun seemed to have accepted the apology, although he still appeared somewhat displeased. When she approached the young master a few minutes ago to explain herself, he was still displeased and called her Black Dagger number 7. But despite this, he said nothing else. Therefore, the lady was extremely curious about what John Yura would do if the young master fully passed the cult leader's trial. However, the girl decided that in that case she could try to pursue the dream she had previously abandoned. After that, she looked at the young man who continued torturing the poor man, and did not stop even when he agreed to tell everything, because he wanted to mock him a little more. Watching his diligent attempts to extract information, John Yura finally calmed down, and even rejoiced that now the hero was dealing with the issue of the disease with black spots not only because of some courtesan. Soon, the satisfied Jin Emyun approached Jong Yura, explaining that this man was from a gang of poor people. His superiors had made a deal with someone from the Huan clan, but even the poor man himself did not know with whom exactly. Of course, it was hard for Jong Yura and the heiress of the Sei clan to believe that the Huan clan was somehow involved with drugs. However, the young man explained that the very assassins whom the poor man had brought along came from the Hidden Trace estate to the Guyu fortress. And as Lady Sa remembered, the third elder had also mentioned this fortress. The Hidden Trace estate is a faction founded by a retired member of the Phantom Assassin Squad 50 years ago. Moreover, as the hero recalled, it was the same squad where his loyal assistant Gu Chil served. It was the elite assassin squad of the Huan clan. Now it had been disbanded into the Phantom Assassin Squad of the Demonic Emperor. In the end, having gathered all the information in his head, Jin Emyun advised the young cult leader to return home now. From this moment, the situation went beyond what they themselves were capable of handling. And considering that these people were scattered in small cells across the Hidden Trace estate, most likely this was not even the main base. As soon as they discover the loss of their liaison, they will erase all their traces and disappear. But the head of intelligence of the Golden Pavilion was curious about how the young lord would act, and he made it clear that he had several new variables. So he decided to start his investigation with the junior sects, for example the tyrannical Sky sect. But Jong Yuri had a better proposal, because, as is known, the problem was that neither the Court of Laws nor anyone else would have time to gather full forces for an attack. Therefore, she decided to go there herself. Since it was an official visit of the young cult leader, they would not be able to carry out anything suspicious too openly. But Jin Emyun could not allow the girl to risk her life for something like that. Partly, Jong Yura was even offended, considering that the hero thought that poisoning their lands and people with drugs was some kind of trifle. However, Jin Emyun really did not care about the spread of drugs, because compared to the value of Jong Yura's life, everything else was nonsense. However, the girl was simply extremely ashamed that because of her presence, the hero's plan went awry. She wished to somehow fix it, and looking at her sad facial expression, the young man realized that it was this very expression he had once fallen in love with. In the end, he agreed to act, and the events moved to the outskirts of the Mountain of 10,000 Peaks. There, literally breaking down the gates before him, the young cult leader appeared. Of course, the third master of the Hidden Trace Manor did not expect the arrival of the young cult leader. He was already about to pack up after the mess caused in the valley. And obviously, he would never have thought that the target to be kidnapped would come to them herself. In the end, bowing, the steward greeted the young leader and decided to find out what they owed her visit for. However, Jongyura calmly reminded that the father of the current steward was part of the phantom assassins of the demonic emperor. She finally realized that she had neglected those who served the Huan clan faithfully and truly, and decided that it was time to fix that. However, the girl was surprised that everyone in the estate looked so busy. It seemed to her that they were packing to leave soon. After that, she suggested to the steward to talk, expecting him to offer his guest at least a cup of tea. However, bowing, the awkward steward reminded her that in all corners of the Mountain of 10,000 Peaks, the young cult leader would never be received as an ordinary guest. Therefore, he decided to immediately escort her inside. At the same time, assassins were watching them from the side. Telepathically, they decided to ask the master of assassins how they should act, and he believed that since they had such a chance, they must capture the girl alive. Walking along the yard in the estate itself, Jongyura noticed with surprise that the condition of the holdings was much better than before, as if the yard lacked no visitors. But the old man did not answer, for they had finally entered. The man suddenly addressed the girl by name, but she ordered the impudent man to address her more respectfully. But he just laughed strangely, for they both understood what was happening here and saw no point in pretending. Finally, Jongyura was surrounded by his assassins from all sides, and the man offered them to surrender without resistance. Then he would not have to treat the girl harshly. Moreover, he was extremely amused that Jongyura was so arrogant. She defeated only a weak group of assassins and believed that no one would ever be able to stop her. However, even those fighters she saw today were not all the aces in his arsenal. At that moment, the girl noticed activated mechanical formation equipment on the roof. The enemy explained that this technique is called the Labyrinth of the Pursuing Murderer. Therefore, he led them here not in vain. And indeed, looking at this entire construction of enormous scale, everyone understood that it required a colossal amount of money and power, and this was definitely not something a retired assassin could afford alone. So it became obvious, the heiress still has much to endure from traitors in the future. But for now, she wished for him to answer whether he was still a dog of the Huan clan, or a traitor who had joined an alliance with the outside world. Without answering the question, the man ordered his assassins to kill those insolent guys. Chonyura took this as an answer, so immediately, releasing the energy of Qi, she rushed into battle against the scoundrels. Very soon, the girl defeated everyone. However, she understood that she still had much to learn, for she wished to fight in such a way that no blood would remain on her clothes. She even thought that because of such an enemy as this old man, it was not worth wasting her precious time and getting dirty, for she could make his tongue tell the truth by other means. At that moment, the man noticed that the heiress had used a Qi aura that blocked the meridians, meaning she wanted to capture and interrogate him. However, he was not going to surrender to those who had brought the loyal squad of phantom assassins to such a state. While the girl was listening to the excuses of this opponent, she did not notice that another man had approached her from behind. The assassin, aiming his blade at her neck. Fortunately, she managed to defend against the strike, but quickly realized that a true master had entered the fight against her. The old man was extremely glad that the master arrived on time, and in the end, the man himself was unharmed. And Chonyura at the same time was amazed that this opponent bypassed her with such ease. At that very moment, the traitor explained to the one who came to help that before them was none other than the young head of the cult. He believed that the man should not miss the chance, for this girl was now trapped in a deadly space. But in the end, the mercenary himself, having approached the old man, tore his head off his neck. He explained this cruelty by saying that the only correct decision was to get rid of a dog that could no longer hunt for its master. Chonyura herself was extremely curious about whom such a powerful master worked for. She promised that if he confessed to her, she would spend all her personal wealth to bribe him. However, on the other hand, she could simply leave a request to the clan of the poor, and they would confess everything to her themselves. At that moment, the wounded assistants tried to explain to the young head of the cult that she should not behave so recklessly with such a dangerous man. However, she knew perfectly well what threat this person posed. Therefore, she was curious about how strong she was compared to the master who could use enhanced Qi aura. Enraged by the girl's words, the man threatened to sell the information that the young lady of the demonic cult had lost her head for a high price. But the heiress herself could only giggle at how confident this man was. In the end, they clashed in battle, each convinced of the audacity of their opponent. Of course, the man was quite surprised that such a young girl withstood his strike. However, retreating backward, the girl reminded that the techniques of the cult of the heavenly demon are not inferior to any other cultivation techniques, at least in their power. Even with a difference in level, she was strong enough, and judging by the opponent's facial expression, the man could not deny this. However, he still reminded that regardless of talent, the chasm of experience cannot be overcome, and he intended to prove this to the inexperienced girl in battle. In the end, the man managed to wound the girl, throwing her back against the nearest wall. However, at first glance, he could admit that a little demoness had indeed grown in the cult of the heavenly demon. He also explained that one person ordered him to capture the heiress alive and bring her to him. But he thought that if he did not kill her today, terrible consequences would surely await them. Perhaps in 20 years he would have to feed her poison to get rid of her. And to avoid this extra work, he would prefer to kill her today so as not to earn problems in the future. However, rising from the floor, John Yura calmly stated that she had been informed that a mechanical space was installed here. She also knew the likelihood that she would encounter a master beyond her capabilities. The only thing she was wrong about was the difference of opinion with that scoundrel. Therefore, she immediately hurried to apologize to Jin Emyun for not believing him right away. And the young man was proud of himself for being right. He knew that these guys would fear the personal qualities of the young leader more than the value of her being the young heir of the cult. John Yura, who had already tried to fight this man, could describe him as definitely a difficult opponent. After all, the 9 great sects were not considered prestigious for nothing. The hero understood that John Yura surely had a reason to assume that the man belonged to one of the 9 great sects and wanted to hear the argumentation. And it was about his fencing style, which contained a secret diametrically opposite to the secret of their cult. And if this was true, the hero believed they had nothing more to worry about. Moreover, now that he had arrived here, they would definitely win. At the same time, the enemy finally realized that another heir from the Jin Heavenly Demon clan had decided to join them. He even felt sorry for this guy. After all, the young cult leader was still destined to die, and he was also signing up for this fate. However, unexpectedly, the man felt the strike of a throwing knife and hurried to dodge. The hero, stepping out of the shadows, explained that in this place was located the formation of the Pursuing Murder Labyrinth. But now this space rightfully belonged to him. Moreover, it was foolish to assume that he came here alone. Simply all his other resources he had used elsewhere. At that moment, many lights appeared behind him, and the hero suggested to the opponent not to worry. He would just play with him, turning the heavens upside down. Obviously, the man was immediately frightened when he heard these words. John Yura noticed this changed aura and wanted to understand what was going on. However, Jin Emyun asked her to focus on survival for now. By that time, the enemy bridges were practically burned down. Inside the building, it was not felt, but outside everything was blazing with flames. So if they continued to waste time, they would be burned to ashes here. Honestly, the man was surprised that these two still believed they would manage to escape. In any case, he decided to show special manners to these two desperate ones. Removing the bandage from his face, he introduced himself as Ji-yoon and revealed his identity. This could only mean one thing. The man was not going to leave them alive. However, the hero was surprised that behind the plan to kill the heiress of the demonic cult was someone from Qingcheng. The man did not answer such an obvious question, believing that the kids who were about to go to hell did not necessarily need to know the answers. At that moment, John Yura prepared her sword and asked the hero to help her in battle by matching his chi movements with those of the heiress herself. After that, the two rushed into battle, while those who were sitting in ambush in the shadows continued to shoot throwing blades. In the end, the tactic was this. While the opponent concentrated his attention on one of these two, the second free person attacked. And so, finally, when John Yura began the attack, Jin Emyun interfered with the enemy so that he could not fend off the assault. The lady from the Golden Pavilion, who was directing the blade barrage, was watching all this attentively. In the end, the duel was going surprisingly well, so John Yura could not help but praise the hero's abilities. Moreover, thanks to the fight, they were slowly beginning to catch the movement of the enemy's chi. At that moment, the enemy realized the seriousness of the battle, so he had to risk even his life to get rid of these boys. Of course, he wanted to avoid using significant techniques due to mechanical construction, but he had no choice left. And looking at the technique the man prepared, John Yura ordered the hero to flee. She refused to let the man go unpunished, so she wanted at least to buy the hero some time so that he could escape. After all, he used an enhanced chi aura. Moreover, his aura was perfectly even, unlike the aura that John Yura herself had. However, the hero calmly stood before the girl, making it clear that he would not leave. She initially did not plan to run away, so she should not give up her life without a good reason. If they leave, they will do it together. In the end, John Yura had no choice left, so she warned that she would use guiding energy. Jin Emyun had to do whatever it took to keep up with her. Honestly, hearing their negotiations between themselves, the mercenary just laughed, thinking that these two might be lovebirds. However, this so enraged the two that they instantly concentrated the energy of their chi, forming a single combined stream. This stream began to literally erase everything around the two, as if cleansing the very space itself. However, very soon the two were already kneeling, completely drained of strength. The opponent, however, was honestly surprised by the abilities of the youngsters. Perhaps, if they had fought a couple of years later, the outcome would have been different. But today, they will die, so that will not happen. However, Jin Emyun was only proud that his miserable life would finally influence the course of history. However, unexpectedly, the traitor felt someone approaching from behind. It was a bald old man who attacked Raga, outraged that this little human dared to threaten the heiress. Immediately after that, the man rushed to the young heiress to assess how severe her injuries were. And Jongyura was slightly indignant because the law enforcer was extremely late. He already felt very guilty, but hurried to explain that the girl's message arrived when he was not at the estate. At the same time, the hero was surprised that the person absent from his post was the Right Guardian, whose task was to protect the cult leader and his family. Jongyura herself was not offended by him, only calmly pointed towards the old man, who introduced himself as a member of the Qingcheng clan, although perhaps it was an excuse to express hostility between the orthodox and demonic clans. Therefore, she ordered to take the man for interrogation. However, it turned out that at the moment when the old man attacked him, he broke his neck, so most likely he was dead. And all that was left for the Right Keeper was to apologize again for his failure. However, according to the hero, everything looked so strange that Jin Emyun was almost sure that the Right Keeper did it intentionally. The Right Keeper still bore the name of the Red-Faced Demon, a demon whom no expert of the heavenly cult would dare to fight. Although later the new keeper betrayed the heavenly cult after 20 years, the Right Keeper himself was already retired by that time. Considering the time and circumstances, he should not have betrayed right now. In the end, because of him, their plan failed. Obviously, Jongyura apologized for the failure to conduct a proper investigation, and only promised that next time she would definitely repay Jin Emyun for everything. Immediately after that, the whole company left. Only after making sure no one was left, the hero called his servant, who had been hiding in the shadows throughout the battle. After that, he began to question Guchil about the results of his investigation. But unfortunately, most of the information was lost in the fire, so nothing could be retrieved. However, the servant found a small piece of paper on the corpse of the owner of the Hidden Trace estate. The hero was extremely surprised that such a fragile sheet survived in this situation. Perhaps it was some kind of joke from the Right Keeper. However, without explaining anything to the confused Guchil, the hero immediately unfolded the sheet and began to read. But what he saw there surprised him quite a lot, which immediately showed on his face. On this note was an order to eliminate a certain person in the Hall of 1001. Of course, the hero had no idea what this Hall of 1001 was, nor did he know who exactly the order was for. However, the young man thought that once he found out all the details, this building would be the perfect place to continue his investigation. At the same time, the servant begged the young master to explain what was going on at all. Jin Emyun perfectly understood. Throughout his life, Guchil had never let him down, and therefore deserved to know about his plan. The hero warned that for some time his faithful companion would have to be separated from him. This news truly terrified the man. Soon the heavenly demon convened a council. Obviously, many were outraged. They could not believe that someone dared to bring narcotic substances and heretical practices into their sacred walls. The elders insisted that the heavenly demon immediately gather an army to destroy the Qingchen sect and unleash an orthodox demonic war. However, Zhang Taizhan understood. Although the anger of all present was justified, he had to act thoroughly and precisely. Firstly, they had to confirm whether this was truly the work of the orthodox faction, or if the culprits were merely trying to start a war. Immediately after that, the ruler addressed the left keeper and appointed him to the investigation. He respectfully promised to carry out any command of the Lord. At the same time, there was jubilation in the demonic heavenly clan. The senior noble scions rejoiced. The young lord helped the heiress uncover the latest incident. Now, among the demonic dragons, it seemed, a seventh had been added in the role of young lord. At that very moment, the hero appeared before his father, explaining that he needed to enter the Hall of 1001. Obviously, Jin Gunak believed that his son had been completely overcome by madness. He was definitely insane. The clan leader ordered that the scion retreat and head to the Hall of the Demonic Dragon. This was a logical decision. However, the young man reasoned that his younger brother would be enough to build connections in the Hall of the Demonic Dragon. He himself intended to recruit new talents from the Hall of 1001. Of course, the man could not believe that his son would go to a place where only nobodies ended up for such a small goal. However, the young man wanted to lure talents to them in advance, who might otherwise join the Ma or Po clans. As the clan leader himself should have known, those who graduated from the Hall of the Demonic Dragon originally belonged to other clans, or were recruited by them. Take, for example, Ma Chulsoa from the Ma clan, who graduated from the Hall of 1001 last year. To be honest, he had a similar goal as the hero himself. And the young heir was no less capable than Ma Chulsoa, so he would handle this task excellently. Of course, Jin Gunak truly supported his son. He really was much better than those degenerates from the Ma clan. Therefore, Jin Emyun greatly hoped that his father would give him some support. Then he would be able to bring people to them who would carry the next generation of their clan on their shoulders. Soon the second brother received news that Jin Emyun was entering the Hall of 1001. The hero had even already submitted an application for admission. Honestly, the young man was quite upset that the second brother was so surprised. Besides his father, more than 10 people bothered him today with questions about whether he had gone mad or was close to it. In principle, These questions were logical, considering that the direct heir of one of the 6 great clans was going to enter that hall where even members of the branch clans are sent only in disgrace. Now everyone was grieving, believing that the lord was in exile because he had put the young heiress in a dangerous position. The second brother also thought that the hero had been punished somehow. However, the elder reminded him that the founder of the Hall of 1001 was the first heavenly demon in his early days. The training methods of this hall were so cruel that many noble offspring perished. The Hall of the Demonic Dragon was founded as an alternative. Subsequently, the intensity of training in the Hall of 1001 decreased. But the hero's goal was to experience the original training regime himself, the very regime that produced true warriors obsessed with martial arts. Honestly, the second brother was amazed. After all, the elder did not even covet the position of clan head, yet suddenly became obsessed with martial arts. Moreover, so unexpectedly. However, Jin Emyun calmly explained to the surprised younger brother that they must become stronger, because a huge storm is approaching. Therefore, he ordered that the younger brother must practice everything he had learned. Of course, the younger one was extremely curious about what his older brother warned him about. However, the older brother only promised that the younger one would soon find out everything himself. After that, the hero proceeded with the admission procedure to the Hall of 1001, and in those times, such an action was equivalent to deserting the army during a family gathering. Therefore, when he showed up at the Palace of the Golden Pavilion, obviously, the head of the Sei considered that the young man had completely lost his mind. Obviously, she also wanted to get a clear answer about his intentions. Among those interested was also Chong Yura. But the hero understood. In order to survive, he needed to answer these questions with utmost caution. Therefore, he explained that he had simply fully realized his own powerlessness. If the young man had reached at least the early stage of perfection, he would not have been so easily defeated. Saying this, the young man tried with all his might to look as pitiful as possible. Of course, the girl tried to calm him down, asserting that they had not lost. However, for Jin Emyun, that shame was a defeat. After all, he could not directly say that he wanted to prepare for what would happen to him in the future. Therefore, the hero told the lady that in the sect everything must be proven by one's own efforts. To become a worthy companion of the young heiress, he had to meet at least the minimum qualification. At that moment, the lady noticed with surprise. The hero and Chong Yura were somewhat similar to each other. When the young heiress of the cult also deeply blamed herself for her own shortcomings, she, taking advantage of this opportunity, decided to enter isolation in order to train herself. The mistress also said that when she comes out of seclusion, she wishes to fight him and compare their results in a duel. For the young man himself, this was literally an admission that she intended to destroy him. Finally, the events moved to the peak of the 100-fold tempering, to the Hall of 1001. There, the fighters' training continued, and they were required to climb to the very top of the mountain without using any internal powers. Their mentor warned the students that they had only 2 paths. Either they would conquer this peak or fall and perish. All that remained for the unfortunate students was to curse this crazy demon who was torturing them. One of the girls especially actively cursed her grandfather, who had sent her to such a shabby place. Moreover, the old man claimed that it would be only a little harsh here. However, his words were very different from the truth. If the girl accidentally fell, she would die at that very moment, no matter how much internal energy she had. Therefore, the girl had to survive in order to repay her grandfather in kind. However, in the end, the rock she was clinging to gave way. Thus, the unfortunate girl already expected to die for sure and screamed as she fell down to the ground. Fortunately, one of the young men came to her aid, who managed to grab her by the hand and help her not to fall off the cliff. In the end, after that, the 2 of them successfully reached the very top. The girl continuously kept thanking the warrior. However, he believed his deed did not deserve thanks, as they were obliged to help each other in order to survive. Honestly, for the rescued girl, it was obvious that this young man possessed a rather special philosophy, at least for a member of the demonic cult. Besides, the young man was clearly embarrassed by being called a great warrior. After all, he did not consider himself such an outstanding person. However, the girl believed that any warrior who behaved nobly could rightfully be called great, and indeed, it was a very flattering compliment from the lady. But calling someone a great warrior was excessive, and for the cruel demonic cult, it was generally extremely inappropriate behavior. So many maliciously thought that it would have been better if she had fallen off the cliff, or that someone should have pushed her down themselves to reduce competition in their ranks. Also, the young man hurried to calm the girl, explaining that such physical training would soon significantly decrease, because when the new leader arrives, they will switch to theoretical classes. Moreover, persistent rumors circulated that someone incredible was supposed to enter the Hall of 1001. This person was the direct heir of one of the 6 great clans of the cult, namely, the renowned demonic heavenly clan Jin. However, the girl immediately thought that he was some kind of arrogant outcast and decided to carefully avoid any contact with this person in the future. Finally, the hero joined the Hall of 1001. However, Gu Chil continued to weep bitterly, unwilling to let go of the young master despite everything already being decided. He shed burning tears, all because they had always been inseparable from Jin Emyun. In the end, the young man could only ask Gu Chil to remain obedient and do as he was told. Moreover, the hero promised to call him often and keep in touch. Immediately after that, having said goodbye, they parted, and the hero began to carefully analyze the people around him. Although it was difficult to judge their true level, their views were extremely serious and focused. After all, in the end, all these people carried on their shoulders someone's expectations or heavy responsibility, so the hero hoped to find someone who could truly impress him. All these young people were soon gathered together, and they were solemnly welcomed in the Hall of 1001. The chief noticed that the eyes of the newcomers were sharp and full of bright light, for which he quickly praised the guys. The disciples themselves whispered among themselves, not believing that this was the very legendary head of the Hall of 1001. In their humble opinion, he had not a trace of proper dignity, and he also behaved quite strangely and unpredictably. Honestly, because the kids did not appreciate his friendliness, the man was deeply offended. Therefore, he immediately ordered them to be silent and listen to him carefully. And everyone in an instant felt a powerful urge to kill, which made their bodies tremble with primal fear. After that, the man, who was also called the Wolf of the Misty Prison, reminded the recruits that the Hall of 1001 is both an educational institution and a merciless place where the iron law of the divine cult reigns, survival of the fittest. After that, he introduced the newcomers to their senior comrades. They entered under these arches no more than a year ago, but differed strikingly from the recruits. The Wolf of the Misty Prison wished for them to name what exactly the difference was, and Jin Emyun immediately named 2 reasons, scars as well as the gaze. The head of the hall was very pleased with this insightful answer. Although he did not know who this clever boy was, he truly had a sharp eye since he noticed it. Also, the mentor hastened to explain that these warriors had already fought not for life but for death, and survived in bloody battles. However, unexpectedly among all the students, the hero noticed the familiar face of Captain San, whose talent was beyond doubt. This was the very captain who in his past life begged Jin Emyun to escape when he went to help the head of the cult. Captain San overcame all limitations because he graduated from the Hall of 1001, not from the Hall of the Demonic Dragon, and reached the rank of captain of the ceremonial demonic squad, one of the 4 squads collecting demonic hearts, which are so important in the divine cult. And although the hero did not know what other talents were hidden among the students, he was obliged to take this person with him at all costs. Soon the head secluded himself in his chambers, cursing the damn King Asura. He was ready to act so godlessly towards his own son, and in return for such help with the young man, he agreed to recommend him for a high position. It turns out that a few days ago Jin Gunak showed up to an old acquaintance, asking him to play along a little for his son. Moreover, the clan head perfectly knew that in 2 years the head of the Hall of the Demonic Dragon would retire, and was ready to recommend him for this position. As is known, the head of the Hall of the Demonic Dragon was one of the most important positions. It was also the best way to get into the Council of Elders, even if a person was not a member of one of the 6 great clans. However, the man still could not understand why he had sent his first son here. He asked his deputy chief for advice. However, he believed that most likely this did not happen by the will of King Asura himself, which means the reason lay elsewhere. Either the head of the cult himself wished it, or Chijin Ming himself demanded it. As is known, the heiress went into strict isolation to train herself because of the incident at the Hidden Trace estate. Possibly because the hero was with her at that moment, he was also decided to be punished. However, to the Wolf of the Misty Prison himself, it seemed that this was not a punishment at all. After all, the request of King Asura was quite strange. Unlike other influential parents demanding leniency in training or security for their offspring, he rather asked only for minor conveniences. Everything is so that his child can train calmly and focused enough. Simply put, his son seemed seriously determined to train and possibly aimed for something more. At the same time, one of the hall's students left the estate grounds and asked his liaison not to summon him so openly anymore. After all, the young man understood how suspicious it looked. The others could suspect him too. The binder immediately apologized to the gentleman, explaining his bold behavior by saying that an urgent order had come from above. However, the young man did not believe that something so important could have happened that the assistant decided to risk years of his diligent work. Honestly, the liaison was amazed that a person who was not even close to being skilled in martial arts dared to be so audacious. However, he tried to calm himself by reminding that he was dealing with a favorite of the top leaders, as well as a candidate for the next head of the section. He had to apologize, as the matter was truly urgent, considering that initially the task of elimination was assigned to the first executor. However, they encountered the young heiress of the cult and were destroyed, so the order was passed to the second, as he was closest to the target. When the young man decided to find out exactly who his target was, the connector used a sound transfer technique so that no one could eavesdrop on their conversation. However, Upon hearing this, the second performer laughed like an unhinged person. He laughed so loudly and hysterically that the assistant, to be honest, was amazed. After all, he himself had accused him of a secret meeting, and now he was attracting excessive attention from those around. Honestly, the second one was simply stunned that all the responsibility was shifted onto him. It seems those who dealt with this before him simply could not penetrate inside the structure. But he was only happy to correct the first performer's mistake and as a result, might have been able to take his place. So he asked to inform the higher-ups that he would handle the target without any particular problems. There was absolutely nothing to worry about except the appointed time. Finally, the time came to meet the wolf of the misty prison, and the hero arrived at his chambers. Barely entering, the young man respectfully greeted the head of the Hall of 1001. And the mentor finally realized that the boy who had insightfully answered his question back then was none other than Jin Emyun. However, he warned the young man that unlike the Hall of the Demonic Dragon, here even the heirs of one of the 6 clans must work alongside everyone else. No one will be carried on hands. So his father might have been somewhat disappointed by their Spartan conditions. However, when the hero promised to behave with dignity and not disgrace the clan's name, the hall leader was even genuinely surprised. After all, the hero was much more well-mannered than expected. The second son of the Ma clan was far behind the hero in manners. However, the hero simply lacked the audacity to be rude to the Iron Wolf, the demonic lord. Although officially the head of the Hall of 1001 is called the Wolf of the Misty Prison, secretly, he prefers the title Iron Wolf, given to him by orthodox sects as a sign of respect and fear. So in this way, the hero secretly flattered him, and obviously the man liked how the boy started the conversation. However, he was extremely curious about what exactly Jin Emyun was really after from him. Naturally, outings outside as well as nighttime visits from guests were categorically unacceptable. Therefore, besides this, he could provide the young man with a certain degree of comfort. However, the hero hoped that the leader would be able to take into account his participation in the exchange ceremony. After all, it was an event of their clan, so his attendance was inevitable. However, the head intended to hear some other answer, perhaps wished to learn the true reason for the young man's admission to these harsh walls. Therefore, without hiding his intentions, Jin Emyun asked him for permission to study in the mainstream. He wished to experience for himself all the greatness of the system that the first heavenly demon created to train his closest comrades. However, it was obvious that the wolf of the misty prison considered it pure recklessness. Jin Emyun spoke about it so calmly, as if he had no idea how dangerous it was. At the moment, about 20% of the students were graduating from the Hall of 1001. About 20% perished, and the remaining 60% did not meet the strict standards, so they were expelled in disgrace. While only about 5% was released from the mainstream. Obviously, the head of the hall believed that the heir had no idea what happens to the other 95%. However, the young man knew perfectly well that the remaining 95% simply perished in inhuman training. What was most surprising was that even knowing this, the youth still wished to challenge fate, all because he was seriously determined to do everything possible to become significantly stronger. After all, it was a matter of life and death for John Yuri in the near future. In the end, since the youth insisted persistently, the man no longer argued and gave him permission. However, he could not admit him alone, as the mainstream training was conducted in groups of 6 people. And indeed, the hero remembered that the very first heavenly demon had exactly 6 closest comrades. They later became the first patriarchs of the 6 heavenly demonic clans. In the end, the leader gave the boy 6 months to gather 6 participants. He could include himself in this number. And obviously the hero intended to take these 6 participants with him, which the leader of the Hall of 1001 immediately guessed. Therefore, he directly gave his permission to the boy. However, he immediately warned the youth that everything they talked about implied that at first, Jin Emyun would undergo the trials of the ordinary Hall of 1001. After that, the wolf of the misty prison also told something important. Due to the harshness of the training process, the son of the Ma family spent the first year here almost like a walking corpse. In the end, after these parting words, the hero left the chambers. However, the youth swore that he would definitely make the wolf of the misty prison regret giving him the power to drag talents out of the hall. A young man was walking through the territory, and everyone around was whispering about him as the heir of the famous demonic heavenly clan, until suddenly he met the red dragon, that very boy. He explained that the heir of Ma, whom the hero had beaten, was his distant relative. At first, Jin Emyun thought the boy was trying to challenge him. However, the youth simply wanted the hero to keep in mind that his opponents were right here, in the Hall of 1001. Of course, it was insanely strange and even a little comical. However, Jin Emyun just nodded and walked away coldly. At that very moment, the young leaders of the clan continued their harsh training. However, the father perfectly understood. The girl still lacked a lot. It was not only that the techniques did not flow smoothly from one to another, but even the circulation of internal energy was intermittent. If the girl fully mastered the enhanced energy of heavenly demise, then some elder of the Qingchen sect would not be able to oppose her power. However, the father clearly saw that his daughter was deeply troubled by something. Perhaps she was afraid to succumb to her demonic nature, or she was afraid of harming someone, for example, that boy from the Jin clan. Therefore, he hurries to remind his daughter that the first heavenly demon founded the cult more than 1,000 years ago. During this time, only 3 heavenly demons were born, a title bestowed only upon an absolute essence born once every few generations. However, the father saw that his daughter had the potential to become a heavenly demon. She could become the first in the history of their heavenly cult to continue this legendary legacy. After all, as is known, truly great ones should not blindly succumb to demonic nature. They are rather obliged to consciously control it, even if as a result it leads to the loss of something dear to them. This path was inevitable. Of course, eventually the daughter must marry and continue the clan's lineage, but at least temporarily she could focus exclusively on completing her cultivation without any distractions. Honestly, the head of the Golden Court was amazed by the words of the heavenly demon. After all, she thought that the head liked the young master from the Jin clan, Jin Emyun, but it seems she was mistaken, and the man himself authoritatively warned his daughter that under no circumstances should she allow anyone to underestimate her. At that moment, intense training was also taking place in the Hall of 1001. At the same time, the instructor was clearly extremely dissatisfied with the work of the recruits. They were snot-nosed kids who could hardly be called martial arts practitioners. However, carrying stone blocks would certainly not kill them. In the end, he allowed them to take a short break and ordered everyone to gather around him to listen carefully. Honestly, even for the hero, the training was damn hard. Fortunately, he recovered quite quickly. It seemed that the blood of the Jin clan still flowed in his veins. However, if the second brother were here, most likely he would have easily carried all these stones with a slight smile without the slightest effort. At the same moment, the instructor reminded that previously 4 great halls had recently expanded to 5. The whole reason was that the Hall of Heavenly Mind was actively recruiting agents, and they could now recommend up to 3 people from each year of training. As is known, the Hall of Heavenly Mind is an intelligence division that in the near future will take the cult under its rule. The fact that such an organization did not notice the representative of the Guardians and the traitors from the 6 clans, and even endorsed Khan Mubek as the ruler of the demonic faction, was extremely suspicious. So for the hero to get into the trio that could be recommended to this hall was an excellent chance to infiltrate it without unnecessary questions. But the instructor revealed that besides the Hall of Heavenly Mind, the cadets had another option, after which he, as if nothing had happened, turned to the heir of the demonic heavenly clan, Jin. Honestly, the hero was surprised by the behavior of this impudent man, but still admitted that the man was partly right. Since the instructor so wished for him to enlighten the students, the hero revealed that the position of gatekeeper of the main entrance of their clan might become available soon. Obviously, the man looked down on the position of gatekeeper of the demonic heavenly clan. However, the hero hastened to remind the instructor that the salary for this position was at least 3 times higher than that of the instructor himself. He knew perfectly well that the junior instructor received 15 lien, while the senior one about 20. But their doors with higher salaries were always open to truly talented people. The enraged instructor immediately descended from his high position, lowering himself right before Jin Emyun himself to find out if he was telling the truth. Of course, he tried to pretend that he was not interested in money at all. Just money, among other things, was also necessary for a decent life and all that. Soon the boy remembered his past life, his former master. He believed that when Jin Emyun mastered the divine art of the falling heavens, he would become invulnerable to water and fire. And now, in the training room, the hero was diligently honing this technique. However, it felt as if it originated in the Orthodox section, so it was still strange for him to get used to it. That battle seemed especially strange, in which, although they suffered, by the joint efforts of Chongyur and Jin Emyon, they still achieved victory. The strange thing was that it is usually impossible to conduct a joint attack using techniques of different natures. But at that moment their techniques blended smoothly like flowing water. Therefore the hero decided to take a closer look at the equipment he possessed in order to understand everything. Therefore, at this moment he imagined that Chongyura was standing opposite him, with whom he had just fought in their first battle. Deflecting a couple of her strikes, he infused his body with the energy of the sword. And now he could not only take a hit but also deflect it. It was clear that the imaginary Chongyura in his head was noticeably upset. Apparently the reason was that she could not make the hero retreat. This is not surprising, as gradually blocked energy began to break through the young man's entire body. In the past, the hero could hardly fend off Chunyura, however now he clearly saw her movements. However, suddenly he literally heard her voice, with which she was mocking him. When he turned around, the young man realized that the art of the divine sword of 10 fangs had similar roots to the art of the demon sword that splits the heavens. It was especially strange, given that the art of the demon sword, sky-splitting, is a secret technique of the main branch of the cult leader. But despite this, he tried to deflect the strike using the 6th form of the art of the divine sword. He diligently strove in this struggle to go beyond the basic swordsmanship techniques in order to surpass the limits of sword energy. After all, he was taking possession of the master's sword and had to behold the path beyond, breaking through the walls of power for himself. Therefore, summoning all his will, he used the technique of the boundless demon space. In the end, he attacked with such incredible force that everyone around felt the bursts of energy. Of course, the head of the hall, and among others, the instructor thought they were attacked, and immediately ran over to figure it out. To their surprise, they saw that their fortified wall crumbled as if it were made of soft tofu. To great fortune, it was lucky that specifically this building, where this wall was located, was used by a small number of students, so no one was harmed. But it quickly became known that the hero himself trained here. According to him, the wall suddenly collapsed, and he was engulfed by a wave of mighty energy. And considering the young man's high position in society, there was also a possibility that an attempt was made on his life. However, to be honest, the head of the Hall of 1001 would sooner believe that the hero himself destroyed the wall while training than that the killer went so far as to try to finish him off here. However, such skill of the hero was still unattainable. He was too young to reach his peak. Moreover, he was not even the head of the cult or an heir. Therefore, everyone immediately scattered to scour every corner and find the violators. The hero himself sat and pondered how the art of the divine sword ended up in the secret library of the Jin clan, and how its master understood the true nature of this technique. He was truly curious about who his mentor really was. At that moment, from the shadow in the bushes, the hero's faithful assistant Guchil appeared. He precisely helped to cover up the traces of the hero's power, since he did not want to reveal that he was capable of controlling the enhanced energy of the sword, so he wanted to pretend that someone had tried to kill him. As it turned out, Guchil not only left traces, but also led them beyond the Hall of 1001 to mislead pursuers. However, he had the feeling that someone was watching him during the mission. He thought that the intruder had indeed come from outside. The traces indicated this. For the hero himself, it was an extremely unexpected stroke of luck that could not be missed. Therefore, Jin Emyun wished for Guchil to try to track down the bastard who dared to come here, and Guchil only smiled mysteriously, for such a task was a trivial matter for him. After all, he was originally from the Phantom Assassins squad under the direct command of the clan. In the past, Guchil bore another name. He was the right hand of the leader, the ruler of the 9 clouds and phantoms. Several days later, a whole month had passed since the second executor received his order. For this reason, the liaison came to him to remind that the second should not ruin the master's plans, who was carefully observing the situation. However, the second promised to deal with everything as soon as the opportunity arose. After all, in the Hall of 1001, they suddenly began to watch everything very strictly. But he asked the master not to worry about anything. Field practice would begin soon. If he failed to recruit the necessary person, he would simply kill him right there. Meanwhile, the hero continued his harsh training in his room. Because the training hall was destroyed, time was freed up to focus on cultivation. Thanks to this, he was protected from the risk of succumbing to inner demons born from the greedy desire for the highest level of mastery. Finally finishing this training, he returned to the dormitory. Immediately, the students began to disperse everyone else to their rooms so that the young master could rest properly. The thing was that they really wanted to join the Jin clan, for then their lives would be turned upside down. However, to do this, it was necessary to prove their worthiness. When the hero arrived, his roommates had already prepared new bed linen for him, made the bed, and arranged everything neatly, and kindly offered the young man to rest. One of the side branches of the Ma family was extremely displeased that everyone was chasing after the hero like that. Moreover, he spoke quite rudely about the hero, especially for someone from a subsidiary branch. But fortunately, the young master was not at all affected by his words. Watching one of the mass rage, the hero suggested giving him a task as well if he was so bored living without them. However, he only grumpily reminded that someone like the young man definitely would not serve. However, suddenly Jin Emyun promised the boy that if he passed the mainstream training, he could surpass even Ma Chulsoa, whom he greatly respected. After that, he asked the boy to think carefully about his offer, since he certainly had nowhere to rush. Immediately after that, having secluded himself in the room, he asked his neighbor to provide what he had requested earlier, and they provided him with lists indicating the current status of all students with names. However, unfortunately, there were plenty of students with names containing the parts San and Yon, which were mentioned in that assassination order. Of course, the first to come to mind was his direct subordinate in his past life, Captain San. However, the hero remembered him as an honest martial arts master, who achieved everything without cunning or connections, and did not interfere in faction conflicts. It was strange that suddenly in this letter he was linked to one of the factions. Moreover, unexpectedly he saw the name Han Muyon. It seemed very familiar to him. It was literally phonetically similar to the name Han Mubek, that very traitor and enemy. So for some reason the hero felt somewhat uneasy. Fortunately, the students knew about this guy. At the moment, he was the most famous talent in the Hall of 1001 and even possessed enhanced sword energy. Obviously, after such news, the hero immediately ordered a thorough investigation regarding him. He himself decided to simply focus on the group training sessions that were supposed to take place the next morning. In the morning, the inspector announced that all cadets would be divided into 9 groups, each of which would go through 2 training battles. Based on the results, 3 groups that performed worse than the others would be mercilessly expelled from the Hall of 1001, and the rest would be sent into real combat. As is known, Qinghai Province was under the influence of one of the largest unorthodox factions, the Tyrannical Heavens, and the man also known as the Monstrous King was one of the 5 great lords of the Central Plains. However, the deceased did not name his successor, and after his premature death, a bloody internal war immediately broke out. The fact that the victory was won by the junior disciple, 28 years old, rather than the elder who had the most impressive forces behind him, was already an anomaly. But even more concerning was the subsequent alliance with the Orthodox sects. In the end, this laid the foundation for the Murim alliance between the unorthodox and Orthodox factions, where their common enemy became the demonic cult. Just the thought of this made the hero's blood boil, so he intended to deal with these scoundrels as soon as he had the strength to do so. At that very moment, the instructor explained that the group leaders would be appointed as senior comrades, those talents who had passed the previous group trials with distinction. The hero had already tried to understand who would be his leader if he ended up in the second group. At that very moment, the girl introduced herself with a voice trembling from excitement, explaining that she had been appointed the leader of the second group this time. Honestly, all the students of the Hall of 1001 had questions. Did this girl really have such excellent grades? She looked overly insecure and by no means super strong at first glance. In fact, the reason for her insecurity was that she ended up on the same team with the one everyone wanted to avoid at all costs. The hero tried not to underestimate the girl because, as is known, in team battles the leader's abilities were a key factor. However, looking at her, he could not deny the thought that their team was doomed and they would be expelled. At that moment, a student from the clan's branch suddenly stood up and asked if it was possible to change the leader. However, the girl apologized and explained that it was impossible to do so because the decision was made by the instructor. They could not change it even if the leader looked unreliable. The hero perfectly understood that the Hall of 1001 was full of rebels and outcasts, so as soon as the girl agreed to disobedience, the squad would instantly fall apart. Of course, he could intervene and settle everything, but he was curious how she would respond to the complaint herself. The girl herself decisively asked what exactly this young man disliked about her. She recalled the wisdom of her grandfather. If children do not obey, you need to hit them well, then they will sing sweetly. Honestly, her facial expression at that moment horrified everyone present, so everyone began to guess what kind of monster grandfather this girl had. The eldest herself understood. Apparently, the boy wanted to test the abilities of his leader, and she was ready to allow him to do so. If he resists her, then Nazar recommends him as the leader, and she herself will leave the Hall of 1001. Of course, after such stormy words, there was no turning back, so the boy entered the fight. All that remained for the hero was to hope that they would not regret it. To his surprise, he immediately noticed that the boy was trying to use the technique that Daniel possessed. It was the technique of the demonic blood dragon clan, soaring under blood. However, at that moment, the face of his opponent became much more serious and confident as she armed herself with a blade. In the end, she easily deflected his attack, and moreover, struck the young man in the chest with her palm, causing wild pain to seize his whole body. However, his condition barely concerned the hero. Simply the stance of this girl looked familiar. However, it seemed to him that when performing this technique, it was necessary to hold another blade in the hand. If this is really the martial art he thought of, then this girl most likely could turn the entire divine cult upside down. At that moment after the attack, the boy went berserk, now wanting to fight the opponent seriously. He imbued his blade with energy. This was not surprising, considering that it was the minimum requirement to be called a master. However, the junior students thought that this guy was incredibly cool, as they were seeing the techniques of the Blood Dragon clan with their own eyes for the first time. The hero just smiled, seeing how seriously the boy had gotten genuinely angry. The leader of the group herself warned the guy that it was better for him to return the sword to its sheath, otherwise he could get seriously hurt. However, he was very furious that someone like this girl dared to look down on him, since he was a member of the Blood Dragon clan. Even the instructor asked the boy to calm down, because if he continued, he would cross a line that must not be crossed. Although the motto of their cult was the right of the strong, they were still in a society governed by laws. The boy must know what that means. In fact, this question literally meant, is the boy ready to disgrace his ancestors? It was the founders of the clan, their creators, who established these laws. Obviously, he could not act that way, so he obediently bowed his head and hid the blade in its sheath. Everyone else immediately began to gather into their groups, and the captains had to explain all the schedules in detail. The hero, on the contrary, was glad that the group leader managed to prove her abilities in battle. This would clearly help unite the group around the leader. But at that moment the girl, having lost all her confidence, approached the boy to make sure she hadn't hurt him when she hit him. Although it seemed like a sincere display of care from her, it sounded and looked like a real mockery. The events moved another half-month forward, where on the training grounds the groups rehearsed various types of formations as preparation for the upcoming battle. For example, the diagonal formations of the Phantom Hawks, after which the girl asked her second team to perform the Nine Clouds formation and the final Ram formation. Finally, when all the formations were practiced, she sent her charges into attack. And after that they rehearsed all these attacks one after another daily until late in the evening. However, after another training session, a side member of the Ma sect approached the hero to talk. He did not know what to do in the upcoming trial, because he feared that because of their leader they might fail, and then they would all be expelled at once. Of course, the hero reminded him that the fool, as the boy called their leader, was able to defeat him with just one jab. However, he thought it was not that important. Still, it was clear that the girl commanded rather clumsily, as if she was not confident in herself, and the hero could not say that the boy was completely wrong. Unfortunately, this lack of confidence had been noticeable in her more than once. The member of the side branch insisted that during the real training battle the hero should give the orders, otherwise they would be completely humiliated. Of course, the guy was quite surprised, considering that such a proposal came precisely from this boy. However, he awkwardly explained that, to be honest, almost not obeying Jin Emyun was more humiliating for him. But unfortunately, he had to admit that the hero was the most qualified among them all here. Everyone else would gladly follow him, and again, even in this he was not exactly wrong. However, the hero refused. Of course, his interlocutor did not understand and wanted to hear at least one logical explanation for that. The hero was about to explain his position when suddenly he was interrupted by shouts behind his back. Of course, immediately two curious ones turned around and began to peer at the training ground. There, the students under the command of the future Captain San were indignant that he decided to use the Terran formation in battle, not the square. It seemed like he clearly wanted them all to be expelled. However, he only grumpily reminded that the captain's orders are not to be discussed. However, the young men were sure. Sandoshan simply did not care that they would all be kicked out, since these problems did not concern him. But they wanted to stay and continue to advance in the Hall of 1001, especially considering that his tactical decisions were truly disgusting. They wished that he, having at least a little conscience, would refuse leadership. Watching what was happening, the hero understood. Surely Sandoshan was still having a very hard time right now. How he knew another of his nicknames was Father of the Wind Demon Corps. He led the most despised of all, the 34th Demonic Corps, with pride in his heart. Thanks to him, everyone in this corps was ready to follow him to the end, and even give their lives at his command. In the end, Sandoshan made it clear that he would not repeat himself anymore, and they had to obey his orders. Otherwise, he would force them to do so by force. The rebel immediately armed himself with his blade, being confident that Sandoshan could not possibly defeat them all alone. However, the most surprising thing was that although just a minute ago everyone was on the side of the rebel, they changed their minds so abruptly. Because despair makes one resist, and allows one to endure their task, and the whole reason is that the guys were simply afraid of being excluded before the exam. After all, although they could rage, they were not allowed to get into a fight. The hero immediately turned to the boy nearby to find out if the situation seemed strange to him. The leaders of each group seem quite unreliable, yet unconditional obedience is expected from them. Right away the guy, lost in thought, realized it seems they were deliberately trying to provoke them to see their reaction. In the end, soon both leaders met to think everything over. Their affairs were progressing equally badly. Fortunately, for the most part, Sandoshan's orders were obeyed, although disputes arose periodically. However, he was worried that they all endured too much. But one grown man caused a commotion. In the end, they were barely separated, but the situation was still unpleasant. The girl laughed. This situation reminded her of what happened last year. Back then, if she hadn't intervened, Sandochona would really have been expelled. After that, Sandoshan decided to find out what the girl thought about the matter he had asked about earlier, which concerned his attempt to recruit her into his ranks. And the whole point is that the elders of Sandoshan were extremely persistent in their desire to get her. However, she once again repeated that she cannot allow herself to be associated with any groups for her personal reasons. Immediately after she said that, the atmosphere between them became much heavier. So Sandoshan, thinking about how to change the subject, remembered that it turned out the girl in the second group had quite a large bump. It was precisely for this reason that she thought she had landed in a complete mess. She was annoyed that the hero obediently obeyed her and seemed not even to intend to oppose. However, at the same time, he can crush her into the ground with the little toe of his left foot if he so wishes. However, honestly speaking, the hero passing by was surprised that she was slandering a person when he was right under her nose. After that, he greeted his captain and senior comrade San with a smile. He was pleased to meet Captain San in this life. Moreover, it turned out so conveniently that he caught these two, because he exactly needed to talk with these two. He smiled and invited his senior comrade Sandoshan to join him. Of course, he was surprised that the boy basically knew who he was. They were meeting for the first time, and he was already asking strange questions. However, the hero calmly explained that he had heard about Sandoshon, about the very butcher of the Great Bear Fortress massacre. Of course, the girlfriend standing nearby was amazed that the young man's nickname even included the word massacre, and he was very surprised that the hero knew so much about his past, even though he was not from the 6 great clans. But the guy smiled and explained that he was very interested in Sandoshon. However, the hero still perfectly understood that he had not yet done anything that could deserve the attention of a talented fighter. After all, in this situation all the hero could claim was that the man before him, although not lacking in talents, still had some problems. For example, internal energy and access to advanced martial arts techniques. The hero could help with that. He swore by the name of his clan that he would make him an unrivaled martial arts master in just 10 years. The thing was that despite the fact that Sandoshon had studied only scattered techniques throughout his life, he still became the captain of the Wind Demon's Corps. In his past life, he periodically shared his regrets with the hero. He believed that if he had access to advanced techniques or elixirs in the past, he would have achieved much more. And now what he desired most in the world was right before his eyes. He was unlikely to be able to refuse it. As soon as he agreed, he would receive full support from his clan. Therefore, the hero very much hoped to get consent. However, although tempted, the warrior still refused the young man. It was clear that he was truly grateful for the offer, but simply could not accept it, which shocked the hero. Honestly, even his girlfriend did not understand why Sandoshon simply would not agree, since he would regret it later if he refused. However, the matter was that he simply could not betray the one to whom he had sworn loyalty. Honestly, the hero did not even suspect that Sandoshon was so loyal to the 7th Elder. If his memory served him right, he had not been so devoted before. The hero tried to explain that the 7th Elder would surely understand. His disciple had been given a chance to spread his wings, and there could be no reason to stop him. However, the matter was not entirely about loyalty. The Elder had simply given him a task. That was exactly why he was obliged to stay close to the senior comrade Han and help him in everything. Of course, the girl immediately understood that it was about that very Han Muyon, which meant everything was connected. The fact was that this very Han was the true heir and disciple of the 7th Elder. But as far as the hero remembered, in the previous life someone else inherited this throne. Perhaps that person simply did not reach the required level of skill in 20 years or changed their name. So the hero was even more interested to find out who this Khan really was. After that, the hero turned his attention to the leader of his group, and she hoped that the guy would also make her some separate offer. But she was refused, because the hero wanted to talk to her about their group. He felt that the time had come to approach his position responsibly, and perform the work with dignity. Honestly, the leader was surprised that the young man uncovered her so easily. However, the time had not yet come due to the settings of the Hall of 1001. After all, before the training battle, she was obliged to provoke as much resentment as possible from her team. Of course, the hero understood that since he had already uncovered her plan, it seemed she needed to think about what he would do with this information. Honestly, the girl decided to listen to the guy since he guessed the true purpose of the training. The hero was precisely about to support her authority as a leader, so he asked her not to deny herself anything. During the victory of the second group, he wanted her to lead them to victory with the same fiery passion with which she sent Ma Jinsen into a crushing flight. However, the girl awkwardly explained that she did not do it on purpose. She was simply very engrossed in following her grandfather's teachings. The hero only smiled at her words. He quickly realized that if the girl had had another sword in her hands at that moment, the matter could have ended with serious injuries. Immediately after these words, the smile faded from her face. She wanted to know who this hero was, and she was especially interested in how he had come to such conclusions about her. Although earlier the young man was merely guessing, now he was certain who this girl was. But for now, he decided to ease the tense atmosphere. He pretended to be quite disappointed that she considered him so ignorant that he was not even capable of recognizing the basics of the two-handed sword style. When someone accustomed to paired swords uses only one, any worthy martial arts master will easily notice the resulting gap. The hero, of course, was a martial arts master who could recognize this. Raising the stick, he infused it with the aura of a sword, quite evenly and calmly. He thought this was sufficient proof for her to finally understand his skill. Of course, the girl was utterly shocked, because manifesting sword energy through a branch was as difficult as manifesting enhanced energy. Without precise control, the branch would simply be torn apart by the force. So, naturally, the girl immediately assumed that the hero was one of the famous 6 demonic dragons. However, when it came to them, only the hero's younger brother was on that list. However, just as the leader herself kept her paired blades a secret, the hero also wanted to keep his abilities hidden. He simply thought they should share secrets with each other. Now they were even. That day, the hero was finally convinced that Pak-san was a girl hiding her identity. Most likely, she came from an incredibly powerful clan. For this reason, he ordered his servant Gu Chil not to take his eyes off her. Of course, Gu Chil immediately suggested to his lord to finish off the girl who seemed suspicious to him. He could do it completely without a trace. However, the hero only gave Gu Chili another slap on the head for his stupidity. They were supposed to protect her instead, because Baek-san does not exist in the future that the hero knows. So most likely, he discovered the target of those unknown killers. As far as he knew, there was only one place with strong enough connections to send a child to the demonic cult that also possessed paired blades. This is the greatest clan of swordsmen of the Central Plains, the Baek clan. The current head of the Paek clan is one of the 5 kings and the leader of the Murim alliance. It is highly likely that Paek-san is his granddaughter. In a few years, the Paek clan and its loyal clans will be destroyed simultaneously, and the new leader of the alliance will claim that the demonic cult is behind it all. At that time, the hero did not understand why they did not defend themselves when they were not guilty of anything. However, all the pieces of the puzzle fell into place if one imagined that something had happened to Baek-san here. However, the hero still had no idea why her grandfather sent his granddaughter here. And besides, the cult leader must surely be aware of this. The hero believed that the man should have at least warned him before he climbed in here. After all, a potential future son-in-law. Well, be that as it may, the hero understood that he would do everything possible to save Baek-san's life and thwart the cunning plans of their enemies. Finally, another month passed. Everyone gathered before the start of the training battle between the 2nd and 4th groups. The standard bearers were allowed to give orders, but nothing more. The team that first captured the enemy's banner won. At last, on the instructor's command, both teams moved into battle. Immediately, both leaders ordered their teams to take a diagonal formation, so they lined up opposite each other. The other spectators were quite surprised when they saw that the fighters decided to start with a power confrontation. After that, one of the guys placed 1 silver ingot on the victory of the 4th group. The choice was such because the instructor of the 4th team gave his all working with them. Moreover, the trio in her team were the first to realize that the incitement to rebellion was only a test, and they tried to follow their leader's orders. It was clear they acted cohesively as a single unit. They even called themselves the Trinity of Demonic Snakes and immediately lunged toward our hero. However, in reality, upon seeing this scene, Jin Emyun was even a little surprised. He did not know how to comment on such a thing, so he simply began to repel the attacks flying at him. Only later did he realize that, in fact, their task from the very beginning was to provoke the enemy in order to confuse or bewilder him. In principle, this was correct, because in a team battle the most important thing is to act as a single unit, properly distributing roles. This trio knew their role. However, unexpectedly, one of the approaching warriors bet 10 gold ingots on the victory of the 2nd group. This person was the instructor. Of course, everyone was surprised that he bet a whole half of his monthly salary. However, he only smiled and suggested that those who were frightened immediately take back their bets if they were so scared. In reality, this trio of demonic snakes came from very simple families. Strictly speaking, they could not even step near the Hall of 1001. They were at the very bottom of the social ladder. They were literally 3 worms. At least that was the case until the Tower of the Demonic Heaven's Tear showed them mercy. Hearing that they called themselves 3 worms, the mentor suggested they at least call themselves snakes. Moreover, the female mentor realized that although they had missed the perfect time to start learning martial arts, she could teach them the techniques that their guards are trained in. Therefore, she suggested that the trio test their fate or try to make a name for themselves. Of course, the entire trio wished to repay Madame for her kindness, as well as for allowing them to enter the Hall of 1001. They swore to repay her. Obviously, to fulfill this, they had to lead their team to victory, and for that, it was necessary to attract the attention of Jin Emyun as the strongest fighter. It was immediately clear. When the trio attacks one person, they are clearly up to something. Moreover, they endlessly repeated their loyalty and passion. Honestly, the leader of the 4th group was furious, not understanding what this trio was doing. They were supposed to suppress the enemy with all their might, but now, during the fight, they were talking to the hero offering their services in case of victory. Moreover, so actively that even Jin Emyun himself was forced to suggest postponing the conversation until the end of the battle. Obviously, the leader of the 4th group could not allow the damn commoners to lose this fight because of their stupidity. If this continued, she, the heiress of the respected Zhou clan, would lose to some simple girl, the head of the 2nd group. Moreover, she had people from the Ji clan in her group. This was generally an unfair distribution. In the end, she had no choice but to order the fighters to reorganize into the Raging Stream formation, all in order to defeat the enemy and claim victory. As the leader of this squad, the girl immediately noticed that the enemies targeted her, so she drew the fighters' attention to the formation of an attack from 2 flanks. In the end, they surrounded the enemy from 2 sides and did not allow them to break through further, forcing them to scatter. It seemed that all this time the 2nd team was only fighting at half strength, forcing them to engage in close combat and attack. Finally, the hero deflected another fighter and immediately signaled the leader. Right after that, she ordered to use the Terran formation and break through the thick of the battle, starting a counterattack. In the end, while some defended their vanguard squad, Others prevented the remaining enemies from breaking through so as not to interfere with the vanguard. They all rushed forward at once, aiming straight at the head of the fourth group. She could only helplessly scream, demanding that the fighters stop the enemy no matter the cost. Immediately, the trinity of snakes stood to defend the leader. They understood. If they allowed the hero to break through here, they could not consider themselves worthy to serve the same Jin Emyun in the future. However, the guy understood. He did not care whether they let him pass voluntarily or not. And the whole reason was that he was not the main player on this field at all. At that moment, the rushing Ma Jinsen was already approaching the leader of the fourth team. To be honest, she could not have thought that the main attacker would be this very guy. In the end, the result of the training battle was on the side of the second squad. He won and joyfully celebrated it. This joy was understandable, including the joy of the instructors whose bets paid off. Especially happy was the chief, who earned the most. And the fourth team was saddened by the defeat. However, most noticeably, the famous trio from the fourth group was literally devastated by grief over their loss. Of course, the hero did not understand why the trio was in despair, and he feared that he was the cause of their sadness. He suspected that perhaps they did not like that they failed to come to the forefront, or maybe they thought that the demonic heavenly tower would collapse if they lost. Of course, the three demonic snakes had no idea when Jin Emyun managed to figure them out. However, these were just his instincts. He had simply lived too luxurious a life for a man of his status. Honestly, when someone lives the life of one of the 6 great clans, abuse of power becomes a tradition, and tyranny, a tool of routine. In the end, he could only promise that nothing would collapse, so they had nothing to worry about. He could also take them under his command, but they had to understand what that meant, because they could expect no leniency. Of course, the trio perfectly understood. The hero is looking for people who would agree to join him in special mainstream training. It's true, but this training still needs to be survived. After all, corpses won't be able to serve him. He hoped that the trio would have enough courage to follow him all the way to hell if necessary. However, after thinking a little, the entire trio simultaneously bowed, ready to follow the hero's order anywhere, even to the underworld. After her defeat, the leader of the fourth squad was truly raging. For these dirty, low-born scum! She didn't understand how they dared to lose under the leadership of the patriarch Clan Z's niece. Moreover, they dared to use Jin Emyun himself to distract her attention. Not long ago, the hero came to her and said that the demonic heavenly tower is one of his favorite places. However, he warned that it would be very unpleasant if the friend's tower evaporated. This literally meant, if she tried to challenge their clan, he would wipe her off the face of the earth. Honestly, the girl had no idea how the hero dared to say such a thing to her. He was supposed to cooperate with people of his level, but in the end he chose some rural scum. But, as she was surprised, when she went out into the corridor, she saw the hero talking with his leader. He asked the leader to call him the right hand from now on. Honestly, the leader of the fourth group had no idea what was going on here. Moreover, it remained a mystery why Baek-san suddenly started behaving so friendly with this guy, especially considering that he looked at his leader of Group 2 with quite a warm gaze, unlike how he looked at her herself. She had the feeling as if literally the whole world had turned upside down. She blamed everything on Baek-san, so without much thought, she decided that the defeat in the training battle, as well as the intervention of Jin Emyun, was also her doing. Only then did everything fall into place. At that moment, the very Han carefully approached the skinny girl. He immediately felt that from the leader literally emanated a powerful hatred towards all of Baek-san. The only question was, did she hate her enough to finish her off once and for all? To be honest, the leader of the fourth group was convinced that Baek-san simply seduced the teachers and forced them to assign members of the Ji and Zhou clans to her group. Or she wagged her tail and lured the naive Jin Emyun into her trap. Only if you imagined that she had arranged everything in advance, everything fell into place. Therefore, the group leader wanted to kill her. Fortunately, the second had an opportunity that he could provide her to finish off the annoying girl once and for all. Soon came the election of the leader for the first united squad of groups number 2, 4, and 5. However, the leader of the fourth considered it illogical for someone from the losers to be the captain. Therefore, she proposed to make the leader the only one among them who won, the head of the second group, Baek-sang. The head of the fifth group, which suffered a major defeat in the first training skirmish, did not object at all. Therefore, everything was decided unanimously. Although Jin Emyun found it suspicious, he heard that this girl even apologized to the Trinity of Snakes, which made the hero doubt even more. Regarding his past life, he could say, right now it was behaving extremely suspiciously. Therefore, he wondered what it was up to. Perhaps she was connected to that very contract killing. Soon preparations began for the training battle at the training ground for the first squad. Of course, the hero approached to find out what Baek-san thought about their new squad. However, she could only say that it was a complete mess. Expectations were such. Everyone after training with their leaders would strictly follow the instructions. However, reality turned out to be completely different. Therefore, with such skills, they would never have successfully used tactical formations. Well, they couldn't do anything about it. so for now, Jin Imyun suggested focusing on teamwork. Baek-san agreed, understanding that it was unreasonable to expect high-level formations from the youths of the Hall of 1001. At that moment, the senior instructor came to the other mentors and placed 10 silver ingots on the first squad. Of course, no one except the instructors knew about it. So now Baek-san could only hope that they would not turn on each other over the right to command as the third squad. The third squad still could not even agree on who would become their leader. So in the end, they decided that all three would guard the flag to be fair. The second squad, their opponents, also did not avoid some disputes. Then Sandoshan made the students understand that they should stop fighting, because the leader of the second squad would be him, to avoid unnecessary arguments. The hero was quite surprised by this choice. After all, Sandoshan was a mighty fighter capable of destroying any enemy. However, he was stuck in the role of captain. It was better for them, so the hero believed. The advantage was on their side. Somewhere around this time, one of his servants came to the second to pay respects. He immediately praised him, because the master had done well in pushing Sandoshan to become the leader. Now in the training fight, he would be tied hand and foot, so they could calmly finish off Pak-san. However, the fighter was worried that due to the recent incident, surveillance of the Hall of 1001 had intensified. If he started acting now, they could be exposed. Indeed, the second was extremely displeased that some scoundrel dared so recklessly to put them at risk. And yet, it was precisely now that they had to act. They had no other such convenient opportunity. If the fighter manages to kill Baek-san, then all eyes will focus on him. He will take the blame for everything else. But the second will find a way to help the guy later escape responsibility. He very much hoped that everything would go that way. However, even if he rots among worms or is executed, it bothered him little. He was raised with the understanding that he was simply a weapon in someone else's hands. If he was no longer needed by his owner, he had to leave quietly. That is what it means to be an assassin. Finally, the time came for the training battle between the first and second squads. The first squad armed themselves with shields to defend against the attack. The second squad tried to break through the defense. But the Three Snakes squad was seriously determined to prove to their lord that they were truly capable of something. At that moment, Baek-san ordered the fourth and fifth groups to concentrate in the center. They could not lose in a contest of strength. However, unexpectedly, all observers noticed that the right flank looked quite open. At that moment, someone ordered the second squad to take the Rising Dragon formation. Only then did the hero notice that the fourth group had retreated, allowing a breakthrough. But the leader of the fourth group very much hoped that the cursed girl would burn in the underworld. Obviously, everyone broke through the defense right at this spot and rushed straight towards Baek-san. It was the turn of the fighter who was supposed to take her life. He perfectly understood. As long as the girl did not know whether it was an attack on the flank or on her personally, she would not understand anything and would not until the poisoned weapon reached her. Only at the last moment did everyone feel the intention to kill that the young man radiated. However, he was stopped by the hero who intervened in the battle in time and knocked the guy off his trajectory. Immediately after that, the instructors intervened, ordering to immediately drop weapons and stop the training battle. Jin Imyun had no idea what was happening. After all, although the instructors had identified the killer, they did not make active attempts to capture him. All this happened under the watchful supervision of the Wolf of the Misty Prison himself. However, he gave no orders, only disliked the action of that guy, which was typical of this old man. And the whole point was that the head of the Hall of 1001 wanted to allow Jin Imyun to personally deal with this assassin. Moreover, he understood. Surely the deputy also had his own suspicions about this guy. So he was simply suggesting to take advantage of this opportunity to confirm whether the hero really made the hole in the wall or not. And all because everyone was extremely curious to find out. Did the Jin clan raise a monster? Or was it just an ordinary guy? However, the deputy warned, if the boy dies, they will all be presented to King Asura on a silver platter. Most likely, only their heads will remain intact. At that moment, standing opposite the assassin, the young man understood. He was unlikely to reveal who exactly sent him to kill. However, the hero felt that the guy was surrounded by the same specific atmosphere of a killer that Guchil emits when he works. This should mean that he was also a first-class assassin. However, it cannot be that someone of such a level was appointed to a subsidiary clan. Moreover, everyone noticed that the hero was clearly anxious, as if he was fighting publicly for the first time. It was obvious, considering that he spread sword energy around his hand. Obviously, the deputy was shocked, because such a dense manifestation of energy among youth of the hero's age was impossible to encounter. However, the old man knew a person capable of this. It was the young heiress of the Jung clan, Yura. Moreover, as far as they knew, Jin Imyun was already acquainted with the girl. However, as is known, most of the heirs sent from the 6 great clans could not even handle the acquaintance. Obviously, if someone like the clan heiress and the hero united, they could become the most powerful pair in history. However, the Wolf of the Misty Prison did not want to predict the future, allowing events to unfold as they wished. At that moment, the assassin had already begun to attack, so the hero had to defend himself. He decided to use the technique of the sixth fang of the divine sword of 10 fangs. It was the infinite demon realm. Energy oozed from his blade, and the guy's stance forced constant defense. In the end, he was thrown back. The hero was quite annoyed that the guy still was not fighting, not giving his all. And suddenly he recalled that once he had already asked someone, what would a first-class assassin do if he failed the mission and found himself in such a situation? Honestly, if Gu Chil heard this, he would be insulted that he, a truly first-class assassin, was compared to this misunderstanding. A first-class assassin should have immediately fled or bitten the poisoned pill and died, but this one dared to end up in such a position. So, obviously, in this situation Gu Chil would have thought, if the assassin engages in close combat, then surely he had another goal. Therefore, the hero suspected that the guy might have stuffed himself with explosives and was just waiting for the moment to blow up. Or maybe he was distracting attention from an ally who was just waiting for the moment to strike, as for example in this case now. In the end, he felt someone approaching Baeksan from behind and protected her with the energy of his sword. And when they looked at the identity of the attacker, it turned out that he was also from the 6th group. Therefore, the instructors immediately detained the entire 6th group, because among them there could be another traitor. The hero himself decided to find out how the mercenary would act now. He could calmly surrender, and then his life would be spared. However, as is known, for an assassin the second most important task after killing the target is to keep the secret. Therefore, from an early age, their brains are washed with various drugs and techniques. All of this together was called hellish hypnosis, which is activated by feelings of despair and resignation. Therefore, the poisoned young man introduced himself. His name was Dok Chol. After that, dying, he fell to his knees, and the hero swore to remember his name forever. Immediately after the incident, the head of the Hall of 1001 invited the hero to his chambers, as he wanted to thank the young man, for many were indebted to him for resolving that incident. The hero understood that the elder did not intervene just to observe his abilities. However, the wolf of the misty prison explained that he wished to witness the birth of a new dragon, and this, honestly, touched him to the core. But the young man himself understood that the man surely had another reason to summon him, the question of his exclusion. Honestly, the head was even frightened by such a suggestion, not understanding what the youth meant. He believed that the student who was in danger acted correctly. Moreover, the head had already told the boy's father everything. He had summoned him here for a completely different matter. On the contrary, he wished to reward the lad. Therefore, he immediately led him along. On the way, he explained that the main flow of the Hall of 1001 does not carry the purpose of training. It is a kind of trial during which a person risks their life. Fewer than 10 people, including the hero, knew the place where he was leading the youth, and all because it was one of the greatest secrets of their hall. Truly, upon entering inside, the hero realized that what he saw was astonishing. As everyone knew, the work of the head of the Hall of 1001 was quite undemanding. However, only those who have reached the peak of mastery in martial arts can hold this position. Apparently, the reason was that they were obliged to protect the secret that the head was now showing him. And the head was amazed by the youth's cleverness, who had figured everything out himself. Finally, opening the gates and removing the seal, he led the youth deeper into the dark corridors. While they were walking, he dared to ask the boy a question: who taught him swordsmanship? However, before answering, Jin Emyon wanted to know for what purpose the leader was asking this question. But, as it turned out, it was simply important to him. Therefore, the youth admitted that he possessed a secret technique described in the secret scrolls of his clan. But the most surprising thing, the man thought that the techniques Jin Emyon used belonged to the Ma clan. The assumption was quite curious. But if this were true, the followers of the Ma clan would stop at nothing to squeeze these techniques dry. However, the wolf of the misty prison understood that they were unlikely ever to attack, since the techniques had long been lost, and the art itself had found a worthy master. After that, the man admitted that his curiosity about this technique was connected to the fact that the art was developed exclusively for killing the heavenly demon. However, looking at the youth's reaction, he quickly realized that most likely the boy had mastered these techniques without even knowing their true purpose. For the true name of the technique is the art of the divine sword. The hero surely should have known this. Honestly, he studied these techniques on the recommendation of a master from a past life, and they seemed quite powerful to him. But he could not even imagine that this technique was intended for killing the heavenly demon. However, he was extremely interested to know how someone like the hall leader knew about this. Well, unfortunately, to answer this question, it was necessary to delve into the history of their cult. Originally, the demonic cult was supposed to consist of 7 great clans, not 6. It was about the Ban clan, the heaven-denying clan, founded by the senior disciple of the first heavenly demon and the potential heir to the position of the cult leader. However, for some reasons, it rebelled against the first heavenly demon and was completely destroyed, and all records about it were erased. The art of the divine sword was practiced precisely by the Ma family, and since then it disappeared from this world for hundreds of years. However, from these words, it could be understood that despite the followers supposedly being exterminated at least 1,000 years ago, it seems that throughout history they still appeared periodically. And the whole matter is that when the second heavenly demon appeared, someone claiming to be a descendant of the Ma family challenged him. Naturally, the second heavenly demon won. However, it is said that even the heavenly demon received serious injuries and was forced to recover for many years. So, recalling the mentor who claimed that the art of the divine sword of 10 fangs could rival even the art of the demon sword that cleaves the heavens, it seems this was not a lie. Especially considering that this person confronted the heavenly demon himself. His words carried weight. However, now the hero had one more reason to find his master. He wanted to know who this man really was, and why he decided to teach him a sword technique shrouded in such mysteries. Truly, there were too many questions. However, he understood that, considering all that was said above, he had learned a forbidden technique within the clan. After all, the heavenly demon is the deity of the demonic cult. Since the technique is intended to kill such an entity, its very study must be considered treason. Fortunately, there was no one else in this space now except the two of them. Perhaps this was to hide the truth. Or maybe so that the man, after everything told to the hero, could calmly kill him as a traitor. However, to everyone's surprise, the leader calmly explained that studying the technique itself cannot be considered betrayal 100%. After all, the art of the divine sword was originally based on the art of the sword that cuts the heavens, of the first heavenly demon. Therefore, as long as it is practiced by the disciples and descendants of the founder, it is not forbidden. So the hero realized that from these explanations he could master this technique only because he was a direct heir of one of the 6 great clans. Long ago, even the head of the Ma clan requested access to this technology from the second heavenly demon and received the records. After that, the head of the hall turned around, asking the young man to follow him, for the time had come to see his reward. However, the darkness ahead was impenetrable, so the hero became alert, grabbing his sword, and the head quickly realized that the boy did not trust him. However, this was logical. If he decided to do something to the youth, the latter would be powerless to resist. In the end, the wolf of the misty prison came up with nothing better than to reveal some secret of his own to ease the youth's fear. After that, he gave his real name, Chongjin-san. He was from the ruling clan. Here the hero finally understood why the man constantly wore a mask. And he added with a smile that even the young man's own father, Jin Gunak, did not know his real name. In principle, the hero decided to obey the head of the hall for now, although the fact that he was from the Zhong clan did not guarantee that they would not decide to get rid of him here. Soon they were passing through the cave, which was illuminated by pearls shining in the night. For changing torches was simply an impractical task. Next was a fork. They could go straight and reach the first gates of the mainstream of the Hall of 1001. However, the chief did not advise going there, unless the young man wished to say goodbye to life. They then turned left into the side corridor. There was the original training hall used by the first heavenly demon more than 1,000 years ago. Of course, he no longer existed. However, in this world, his imitation was created. So he decided to show the young man the heritage that had been left precisely for him. Here at last they reached that very reward. Even the head of the hall himself could not break into this very treasury. Of course, from this one could conclude that the room had remained untouched here for 1,000 years. He thought it was quite unreasonable. After all, nothing stops humanity. Even when there was a mountain in the way, they could dig right through it. But here they could not open just one storage. However, the man calmly reminded the young man about what was above them. This was a statue of enormous size, which was easy to take for a consecrated object. So the hero's proposal literally sounded like destroying a sacred monument to take the treasure inside, which was extremely ignorant. The chapter did not fail to notice this, for although the young man looked gallant, there was great disorder in his mind. In the end, to spare the boy embarrassment, the man pointed out the marks that were on the gates. He realized that these were marks of the movements of the divine sword of the 10 fangs. For this reason, the wolf of the misty prison had brought him here. The chief himself explained that if he understood correctly, when a person precisely repeats the path of the blade imprinted on the gates, the doors should open. Naturally, the movements must be repeated from the 1st to the 10th without a single break. However, to his regret, the hero was currently unable to do this. But so that the chief would not ask too many questions, the young man decided to demonstrate his skill. To begin with, he performed the strike of the first fang of the art of the divine sword of 10 fangs. After that, he showed the result. The line gradually began to fade. Because to fully draw all 10 forms, from the first to the last, the first form must shine for at least 20 seconds. However, his current abilities allowed it to shine for only 2 seconds. If he used enhanced energy, it might be a little easier. But to draw all the forms accurately and damage the gate, he needed to reach the cultivation level of the unmatched demon warrior. Of course, it was very regrettable for the chief to hear this, because it would take decades. However, the young man reminded the chief's words. He claimed that what was behind these gates was his reward. Therefore, he asked the man to guarantee that when he finally opened this treasury, he and his clan would have the right to its contents. However, unfortunately, the wolf of the misty prison could not promise everything the young man demanded. From the reaction, one could guess that what was inside must be the most terrible secret of the Chong clan. Therefore, he asked that the leader take what was necessary for his clan and leave the rest to him. Obviously, the hall leader became interested. Whether the young man realized what could be behind these gates at all, he had no idea. However, he had guesses. If they were correct, then even if he could open the gates now, it was not worth doing so yet. For if he became too bold, he truly could die. However, quite suddenly before leaving, he noticed some other beautifully shining orb on the gates. It turned out to be the energy-absorbing orb. It was the color of the gates, bright purple. This orb was an instrument that responded to internal energy and was also capable of activating specific mechanisms, but it responded exclusively to certain types of internal energy of the Chong clan. For the other 6 clans, even orthodox sects, the reaction was 0. Probably, for this very reason, the hero had the feeling that he himself would be able to open this door. Perhaps there is a reason why his mentor so insistently demanded that he master the divine art of soaring in the heavens. In the end, the young man decided to at least try applying his energy to this orb. He understood that if the gates opened, retribution would follow. However, he did not expect that this would happen. He decided to use at least a small amount of his energy to test his guess. If it seemed to him that the gates began to open, he would immediately stop. In the end, as soon as the boy touched the sphere, he immediately felt the energy from his body begin to circulate back into it. His consciousness instantly transferred to a certain altar, where some bloody drama was taking place. The man was crying, not understanding why he was not even allowed to hug the woman he loved. This prohibition came from the master himself. Therefore, he swore that despite the fact that he was his mentor, he would never forgive him. Of course, the others nearby tried to reason with the older brother, that he should watch his words when speaking with the mentor. However, someone who approached immediately tried to calm the younger brother Jin. It was clear. Their older brother had lost his mind. Their words no longer reached his ears. But still, everyone was amazed that he refused the highest honor for the sake of a woman, and even allied with their enemies. However, the older brother ordered that from that moment on the others call him a traitor. Not the older brother. He no longer cared. And he also swore to the master that the day of reckoning would surely come. For the first to take the path of betrayal was the master himself. The mentor remained serious even after these words. Finally, at the end, he looked back, asking Jin Yemin why he just continued to stand and watch. Immediately after these words, the delusion left the youth, and he woke up again in his chambers. Of course, he quickly realized that this was someone's memory from the past. But if you connect everything he knows, most likely the one who looked at the mentor at the foot of the altar is precisely Ma Myung, the founder of the technique that can kill even the heavenly demon. At that moment, shaking himself off, the head of the Hall of 1001 ran up to the hero, trying to understand what had happened to him and whether he had understood anything about this mystery. However, the young man calmly explained that nothing had happened. It was just that his internal energy was absorbed much faster than he expected. He decided to lie simply because he believed it was not yet time to say something like that. But at that moment he felt his consciousness fading. It seems now his energy core was completely depleted. This was astonishing. That an ordinary person, being devastated, experienced torment, for the core was cracking, and the body was experiencing symptoms of decay. However, everything was fine with him. Therefore, the master simply asked that the boy be more careful in the future, for unlike the mainstream, he can challenge this trial at any moment. In the end, the young man realized, since all his energy was drained in just 10 seconds, he surely needed to be at the level of the unrivaled demon warrior to even think about seeing all the sealed memories, so they hurried back. From what they have already found out, the situation in the Hall of 1001 is ideal for an assassination attempt. However, no one would make such an obvious attempt, no matter how urgent the necessity. And the 6 great clans are confident enough that they can handle the consequences to go that far. Obviously, the wolf of the misty prison believed that someone from the 6 great clans was involved in this. However, thanks to the help of Jin Emyun, his clan will be able to avoid suspicion. While the leader promised to turn to the head of the cult himself for clarification of the situation and reveal the true identity of the girl Baek-san. At that moment, the girl herself tried to confess to the young gentleman who she was. However, he was the first to suggest that she was the granddaughter of the head of the Murim Alliance. Of course, the head of the hall was surprised that Jin Emyun knew this information, and she quickly realized that during their conversation the hero was not probing the ground for nothing. What surprised the most was that the boy also knew about the 3 phoenixes of the Central Plains. It turned out that Baek-san is one of the 4 phoenixes, the sword of the southern lotus flower, as she was called. However, the hero's gaze eloquently expressed the deepest distrust. It was literally imprinted on his face. Baek-san was deeply offended. After all, she was the true pride of the Baek faction, although outwardly she did not seem so powerful. Jin Emyun, of course, tried to justify himself, noting that the girl looked too young to be counted among the 4 phoenixes. However, the warrior woman reminded that despite her youthful appearance, she was already 18 years old. To be honest, this information struck the hero to the very depths of his soul. It turned out that the young heiress and Paek-san were the same age. This also meant that the girl was a whole year older than Miss Se. Now that this issue has been raised, Paek-san did not fail to remind that Mr. Jin was only 17 years old. Therefore, she demanded that from now on he call her nothing but elder sister. However, the young man resolutely refused this demand. The head of the hall was pleased to observe the lively conversation of these two, but he suggested moving on to the main issue. However, before that, the girl, bowing deeply, thanked the hero for saving her life. She swore by her name and the honor of the clan that she would definitely repay him one day. But still, the young warrior was troubled by one question. Since the hero had already helped and saved her life, she wanted to be a little bold and ask him for help once more. Of course, the young man immediately asked the head of the hall for permission to leave. However, seeing how Baek-san clung to Jin Emyun and begged him, he asked the youth to at least listen to this request. In the end, the girl hurried to explain to the hero that she had not ended up in the Hall of 1001 by chance. Her uncle and some elders had made an alliance with external forces. They wanted to overthrow her father, the next patriarch of the clan. These external forces were the society rejecting the heavens. More precisely, a certain group within this organization. Her grandfather told her that the mysterious organization controlled not only the Murim alliance from behind the scenes, but also most of the 10 great sects. Honestly, Jin Emyun was shocked that the scoundrels from the society rejecting the heavens had infiltrated not only the orthodox and unorthodox factions, but also the demonic one. Apparently, instead of trusting other allied factions, the girl decided to flee to the demonic cult. Even so, this did not explain why assassins had been sent after her. However, the young warrior perfectly understood the reason for their appearance. She showed the green blade that she carried in its sheath. It was the sacred treasure of the leader of the Murim alliance called the Jade Sword. However, the young man was puzzled by how anyone could trust a leader who had lost his sacred treasure. It is not surprising that the King of Swords fell into disgrace in his past life. Therefore, the frightened hero wanted to know how it even happened that the head of the alliance smuggled the sacred relic into the demonic cult. However, the girl hastened to explain that at the moment she was many times safer in the demonic cult than in the alliance itself. After all, at the center of the alliance stood the Udan sect, and they planned to appoint Murim, the supreme sage Guan Hyun, as the next leader of the alliance. It can only mean that the blade will pass to the current leader of the Udan sect. It was the name of a man who would be glorified as a great hero of the orthodox world who destroyed the demonic cult. And also he was the very one who pierced the heart of John Yura with his sword. Obviously, the girl immediately noticed how furiously the hero went berserk, as if the aura in the room had changed beyond recognition. However, interrupting her, the young man wanted to ask her just one question. He already understood that the Sword King decided to use their cult only to resolve internal conflicts among the orthodox sects. In part, though roughly, the hero was right. However, the girl hastened to explain that if it were merely a power struggle, no one would dare send assassins into the very heart of the divine cult of the heavenly demon. Not only orthodox or unorthodox sects are involved here. Most likely, someone from the very demonic cult is involved in this matter. And of course, there must be some organization, or simply someone who unites all these forces into one. Of course, so far they have noticed neither trace nor spirit of these people. But they exist. She was absolutely sure of that. Moreover, the head of the hall also believed that one of the 6 clans was connected with these people. The hero knew this perfectly well. Besides, he was informed about which exactly of the 6 clans was the traitor among them. However, there was no guarantee that this incident was really the work of that very clan. And even if it was, exposing them prematurely could be extremely dangerous. What is even more important, the young man still could not fully trust the head of the Hall of 1001. Although the cult leader considered him reliable enough to share information about Baek-san, to be honest, their leader had a questionable intuition about people. After all, it was this very person who previously created the Hall of Heavenly Mind so that it would be his right hand. But in the end, this same hall threw the entire cult into the abyss of chaos. At that very moment, the hall leader admitted that at present there were very few people he could fully trust. Therefore, he firmly believed that Jin Emyun would not ignore this crisis. Still, as a faithful follower of the divine cult of the heavenly demon, the young man had to do everything in his power. Of course, the hero wanted to find out what would happen if he ignored this problem. However, in response to such audacity, the mask of the hall leader even began to crack at the seams. Therefore, the young man immediately hurried to joke that it was just humor, and he had no intention of abandoning them in trouble. Moreover, since there was a traitor among them, they absolutely had to work together and expose him. After all, that was the most logical solution. However, the hero reminded that the patriarch of his clan would not act just like that without clear substantiated evidence. Taking any measures without them would be pointless. The problem was that all his authority and influence came from his father. Therefore, it was necessary to push Jingunak to act. And for that, the hero needed the help of the hall leader and Baek-san herself. After that, the young man sat down at the table, suggesting that the two of them start negotiations. Now it was time for the hero to gain and reclaim his own independence. After some time, they finished all the work. The hero ended up with a whole stack of papers with the results of their excellent negotiations. Honestly, the girl and the hall leader were exhausted after these negotiations. It felt like they were bargaining with a seasoned merchant, and the whole point was that the hero bargained for the best terms and payment for himself. After all, in the past, he managed the inner court of the great divine cult of the heavenly demon. However, in return, the young man promised that he would definitely work off the received payment. And if the opportunity arose, he would also try to urge the patriarch to take action. After that, the youth was ready to listen to the conditions of these two. And Paek-san noticed that the first attempt on her life had failed. She doubted that they would try to use the same method in the near future. So now the girl was going to leave the cult's walls. She was already planning to return to Qinghai soon. However, the youth reminded that not only she alone, but a whole group was supposed to be sent there. Moreover, the hall leader reminded that he was the main one, so if it was necessary to change the rules of the task, he could easily do it. Thus the hero understood. The girl was going to leave the cult's walls. It seems she wanted to use herself as bait. It looks like she actually wanted the hero to help her with this. The young man was already about to leave, but the leader hurried to grab him, reminding the buyer that services are non-refundable. However, Jin Emyun was too frightened by such a task, considering that enemies could jump out from any bush. But Paek-san was sure that this plan was aimed exclusively against spies from the Hall of 1001. External enemies were not to be feared. Moreover, the hall leader believed that interference from external forces would actually help them. Besides, the cult leader had already approved this plan. And in that case, the hero had only one idea, which he decided to express. After all, they could not catch a bigger fish using information that only the young man himself possessed. After some time, the liaison appeared to the second to report that the elder was furious. Thanks to this, he could enjoy the rare opportunity to reprimand him for the first time in a long while. After all, the second had failed the assassination attempt. But that was not the only problem. A greater threat was his hasty contact with the daughter of the Jew clan. However, the young man reminded that even though she was now in prison and the consequences had caught up with her, there was no reason to recall her name. After all, his demonic soul-binding technique was simply flawless. However, the assistant hastened to disappoint him. It was too early to rejoice. Someone could notice the manipulations over her soul and perform an exorcism. However, the young man understood. Whatever they did, they would not detect any soul binding. He only slightly adjusted her thoughts, consciousness, and pushed her towards extreme measures. This incident would be recorded as the outburst of a woman driven mad by envy. So it was a quite acceptable result of the work. Of course, the liaison did not forget to convey the main task. The Jade Sword of Heaven had to be returned. And if the second's efforts bore no fruit, then he would be disposed of as useless. Therefore, the trip to Qinghai was his last chance. As a result, the original plan was reinforced. Moreover, this time a squad of the otherworldly king was prepared to assist him, so he was obliged to finish off this girl once and for all. Of course, the second immediately decided to request support from the third of the society rejecting the heavens. But the assistant considered this already over the top. After all, involving the society rejecting the heavens was clearly unnecessary and attracted attention. However, the second believed that the work needed to be done properly this time. Moreover, the third had always wanted to work with the demonic cult, so he would gladly agree. Of course, the second promised to create discord, not war, and would do everything to ensure no more mistakes happened. After some time, the entire dorm room was filled with gossip about Baek-san. Everyone wanted to know who she was, since assassins had even been sent after her. Someone recalled having once heard about one of the four phoenixes, who was named exactly the same as her. The girl literally walked from the tents to the training grounds to avoid unnecessary questions. All she wished was to leave for Qinghai as soon as possible. The warrior was already fully prepared as bait, and looking at this indecisive girl, everyone understood that she could not possibly be the flower sword. That was precisely why she tried to look as harmless as possible to avoid attracting attention. Somewhere around this time, despite the late night, the hero continued his training. He worked until exhaustion, and his trio of followers was beside him, encouraging their master. They were amazed at how he could swing the blade so freely, even while wearing heavy iron shackles. They deeply respected him. However, the hero quickly grew tired of such flattery, so he decided to come up with something to occupy these guys. In the end, the young man put the same weights on them. They were lighter than those on the hero himself, each weighing 30 kilograms, and the youths had to do push-ups with them. In the end, he knew that pure strength was more important, so they had to forget about internal energy. Obviously, if a person from birth consumes elixirs like rice and learns the best martial arts techniques, then there is no need to engage in special physical exercises, or simply talent was needed at the level of Chongyura. But for the others, in order to survive in this flow, it was necessary to try. In the end, they kept doing push-ups because they believed their life was in service to the master. However, they did not even begin to complain, because these three lacked neither courage nor determination. Initially, there were 2 more guys who worshipped Jin Emyun like a deity, but they ran away as soon as they heard about the main flow. These 3 were not like that. So the hero suggested they do training with additional weight. If they could endure it, then for each of them he would select a suitable martial arts technique from the secret archives of the Jin clan. And of course, everyone immediately became eager to train in order to serve the hero faithfully and truly. At that moment, a visitor appeared to the young man, noticing that Jin Emyun and his followers were extremely devoted to training. However, the young man was shaken when he realized who this visitor was. It was Chongyura, who unexpectedly came to see him. Honestly, the hero couldn't even count how many months had passed since their last meeting. Moreover, he was even afraid to imagine how much stronger the girl had become during all that time. Although less than half a year had passed, it felt like she was already a completely different person, more like her former self. When the hero saw the lady, he immediately flew up in fright to fall to his knees. However, he quickly realized that it was Chongyura, who also noted that the hero had become significantly stronger recently. But at that moment, the trio demanded from the unknown lady that she show more respect to the person from the demonic heavenly clan Jin. The young man, of course, tried to explain to the guys that they should stop and not behave so rudely. However, he could not reveal the lady's identity to them. Therefore, the trio continued to demand that the woman mind her manners and show respect to their lord. Thank God the trio had at least one sane mind, so one of them persuaded the other 2, reminding them that when they intend to defend someone's dignity, they should at least know whom they are addressing. After that, he apologized for his foolish brothers and greeted the young heiress of the cult. After that, he introduced himself and explained that his comrades had no idea what the young lady might look like. Therefore, they mistook her for someone else. Fortunately, the girl quickly forgave them. When they were alone, the hero decided to find out why the heiress had made such a long journey here without a single bodyguard. However, she calmly explained that she had arrived with a bodyguard. The hero just hadn't noticed him. Obviously, if there was a bodyguard nearby whom the young man could not detect even with his heightened skills, then it was surely the right keeper. And as soon as the hero guessed his identity, the same person appeared behind the lady, apologizing for not coming earlier. Immediately after that, he created a sound barrier around the 2 of them so that they could not be eavesdropped on. Then Chongyura decided to discuss with the hero the fact that he would soon have to go to Qinghai. Jin Emyun, of course, was surprised that Chongyura already knew everything. However, she could not ignore such news, especially considering that everyone around was speculating that one day they might become a couple. The hero, of course, was surprised by these words and honestly did not believe them. So Chongyura even thought that the guy was uncomfortable with her attention. However, the matter was simply different. It was very hard to believe what he had heard. But at that moment, breaking the atmosphere, Chongyura decided to find out if the young man knew about the society rejecting the heavens. And honestly, the hero could not believe that Chongyura's people had already found out about this society. However, the hero remembered that in one of the battles he himself had given a lead on this. Of course, it would be a lie if he pretended to have no idea what was being talked about. Perhaps the girl just made a guess because he carelessly mentioned the society rejecting the heavens, and she is now trying to grasp this illusory chance. However, it was also obvious that the young man really did not want to lie to the lady. Therefore, he calmly explained that even if such a group existed, it did not deserve the attention of the young heiress. After all important matters of their cult were handled by the leader with the elders. The rest was left to followers like him. The young man hoped that the lady would understand what he was trying to say, and would not press further. However, the girl seemed offended by such a vague answer. Therefore, she immediately hurried to say goodbye to the young man, and, wishing him luck, walked away. However, to the hero's surprise, the right keeper was looking at Jin Emyun a little too attentively after Chongyura left. Although he did not understand what was being discussed, he clearly saw that Jin Emyun lied about something and refused the lady. Of course, he was not eavesdropping because he was a servant and could not eavesdrop on his mistress's conversations. But he had been watching the young heiress all her life and read the nuances of her mood better than anyone else. Of course, the right keeper was truly a devoted servant, and he was not lying here. However, the hero was no fool either, as he had known the lady for quite a long time. The right keeper himself wanted to get an explanation from the boy about why he hurt his lady's feelings. Deadly intentions came from the military commander, like the true hell of a demon. However, the young man hastened to explain that he refused the lady precisely as if it would be better for her herself. She was not so weak in spirit as to be hurt by such things. Therefore, the youth demanded that the guardian not insult the lady with such words. Honestly, despite a momentary anger, after these words the man quickly came to his senses and laughed. He liked the firmness of the youth's spirit. He approved of such. It was clear that the blood of the Jin clan definitely flowed in him. Moreover, he had heard that the boy was soon going to test himself in the mainstream of the Hall of 1001. However, the warlord asked that the boy not forget to leave one free place behind. After all, the young heiress wished to join this campaign with him. And for the hero, frankly speaking, this was literally an alarm signal in his head. After some time, the young man met with a trio of followers, warning that they would be sent to the Society of Qinghai Enlightenment Seekers. These were the domains of the demonic cult, which originated from the divine cult of the Sun and Moon, the predecessor of the divine cult of the Heavenly Demon, whose history lasted for more than 1,000 years. Obviously, because of this, it was easy to conclude that the traditions of demons still remained in these lands. Obviously, the trio expected that there still existed such things as human sacrifices and mass bloody rituals, as well as some demonic forbidden arts. However, the hero understood one thing. If their guesses were true, the state army would have long ago wiped the Society of Seekers of Enlightenment off the face of the earth. Even their cult never did anything like that. However, the trio seemed to think that secretly such a thing could be used. However, one of the brothers hastened to explain that such cruelties could only have existed in some very distant, mysterious past, back in the times of the divine cult of the Sun and Moon. And after the founding of the divine cult of the Heavenly Demon, human sacrifices were abolished. The young man was surprised at how well the boy knew history. It turned out the head of the tower periodically tutored them. She said that since they want to become warriors of the demonic Heavenly Tower, they must know the history of their own cult. However, despite the fact that the older brother tried very hard and studied, the other two younger ones even avoided regular gym lessons. Ignoring this, the hero asked to pay attention to the fact that demonic arts are essentially connected with what Taoism calls the cultivation of immortality. Just as righteous energy and demonic energy fundamentally are forces that shape the world, with the only difference being how they are used, both paths ultimately lead to the essence of the immortal demon. Obviously, there are no official records that anyone has achieved this. However, one person got extremely close, and that was precisely the Heavenly Demon. Jin Emyun told them about this for two reasons. The first was that they needed basic knowledge about the place they were heading to. The second reason lay in the secret technique that he promised them for completing his training. Therefore, the young man handed them the cultivation technique of the King Tyrant. From that moment, the entire trio had to learn to master these techniques. Obviously, for the youths, it was like manna from heaven, which they prayed for. Especially considering that the young heiress of the cult would personally join them in this trial. So they had to become much stronger. With these advanced demonic arts, they needed to forget about fatigue. They really seemed not to understand that they would die by her hand if they were weaklings. The hero tried more than once to describe to these fools the outcome of life. However, they did not care. They were even ready to die for such a powerful art. And the hero no longer knew how to help your kind. The cultivation technique of the King Tyrant, when fully mastered, allowed one to reach the level of an unsurpassed warrior. Obviously, the entire trio dreamed of this level. However, the hero understood. He was still extremely far from this level. Of course, the young man realized that they were beside themselves with delight. After all, this technique far surpassed the trashy cultivation that had been available to them until now. However, if they recklessly rushed to study the advanced technique of demonic martial arts, trouble could happen to them. They could literally become possessed, which was actually happening now, as they did not take their eyes off the book. And afterwards, they could experience an energy deviation and a complete collapse. Partly for this reason, the hero loaded them with black iron, in order to directly teach their bodies proper discipline. The plan with the Society of Seekers of Enlightenment might have a not entirely obvious benefit for them at first glance. Their methods of controlling demonic energy were comparable even to the divine cult of the Heavenly Demon. Moreover, it was possible that for the hero himself this expedition could become fateful. The next day, the chief inspector gathered all the trainees, announcing that their training was over, and tomorrow they would depart for Qinghai. Everyone was happy while the inspector explained that they would be divided into 2 squads, which would be assigned to 2 locations. Their success in Qinghai would affect the final evaluation. However, the inspector noticed that the cadets were celebrating too much, seemingly not listening to him at all. They already understood that they would go to Qinghai, and therefore most likely end up in Haidun or Xinyan, and were very happy about it. The young men hoped they would not be sent to some complete wilderness. Most of all, hopes were pinned on the city of Haidun. Even the society rejecting the heavens did not dare to lift a finger there due to its proximity to the Fire Dragon sect. While everyone was dispersing, the trio of followers continued their training, standing in a plank position. Honestly, the other cadets were amazed by the endurance of these 3. They still survived despite the hero's training. However, they even felt a bit sorry for these poor fellows. Moreover, Pek-san also joined them, although she didn't really want to do it. All her thoughts were about that pink-haired leader of the 4th group. After a couple of days spent in the dungeon of the Hall of 1001, she died. In the death note, it was said that she wished to atone for the shame brought upon her clan. However, Pek-san understood that this girl would never have acted like that of her own free will, so she also needed to be on guard. The events moved to Haidun, to the Society of Seekers of Enlightenment, where they were extremely outraged at the degenerates from the society rejecting the heavens. The man had no idea how they could afford to squander finances like that. Moreover, they didn't even use force against the Society of Seekers of Enlightenment, which meant they couldn't even request support from the divine cult of the heavenly demon. The head of the society understood that now even a visit from the cadets was quite problematic for them. He was extremely worried that they might take credit for all their work, because they could very well find out what they were doing here. Or perhaps they were secretly planning to take their treasure for themselves, which would quite explain their presence. So the head of the society understood. They would have to hurry their plans a little to avoid trouble. Therefore, he asked the assistant to keep the guys from the Hall of 1001 occupied for now. Just at that moment, the delegation arrived. However, the trembling man reported that a big shot had arrived with them. Of course, the man immediately assumed that it was someone from a subsidiary branch of some important clan. From time to time, such people appeared. Those who failed in the power struggle within their own clan were regularly kicked into the Hall of 1001. Usually these were the most audacious brats, the worst troublemakers. However, as the assistant understood, this person was Jin Emyun from the demonic heavenly Jin clan. The frightened head of the society immediately ran to the doors to meet the young master. Upon arrival, the hero had a logical question for their instructor. Why did he decide to use his real name? The reason was that recently the Society of Seekers of Enlightenment had not been very welcoming to them because they had no special connections. Therefore, they decided to use the hero's name Influence. In return, Jin Emyun demanded that the instructor help him when the time came. The instructor was grateful for such generosity from the boy. At that time, the head of the organization was already running to meet the young master. After some time, while walking with the man, the hero decided to directly ask, had their society faced any problems, particularly in terms of finances? Of course, the chubby man was curious about how the hero learned about these problems. However, everything was clear at first glance if one looked around the society itself. However, so as not to embarrass the host, the hero remained silent. Instead, he simply asked the man to share the arising problems with him. After all, the young man might be able to find a solution. At first, the head of the society was extremely doubtful. After all, the hero was not an outsider. But soon, after locking himself in a room with him, he told everything that had happened. He also spoke about the junior disciple of the society rejecting heaven, who clearly had his eye on Haydn. It seems he intended to push the boundaries towards the Fire Dragon sect. Because despite the fact that a path to the ancient treasure was open there, he was advancing precisely towards them. In his past life, the hero did not immediately realize that a few years after this event, fame about Cheon Muson would spread as the Sword of Dark Clouds. But at the same time, Jin Emyun clearly remembered that before the internal strife within the society rejecting heaven, there was no word or trace of him at all. Moreover, the young man doubted that Gyum Chosen, the first among their disciples, would allow such behavior. Therefore, he decided to find out directly. Had any other masters from the society rejecting heaven appeared here? It turned out that none had been observed yet. So far, there was only a motley rabble causing unrest. Therefore, the young man quickly sorted everything out. Firstly, a lot of resources had been invested in Haidun. Secondly, Kim Chosen strictly monitored the behavior of other students. And thirdly, even with such investments, no noticeable actions were taken. The conclusion could be confidently assumed. These resources belonged to the society rejecting the heavens, but they surely came from a new source. And also, considering the future that fate prepared, everything fell into place. The head of the society himself asked the young master to ask him all necessary questions, and he, being a friend of the divine cult of the heavenly demon, would try to answer them all. Obviously, the hero immediately decided to find out. In that case, how are the excavations of the tomb of the mysterious maiden of the heavens going? Of course, the man was frightened upon hearing these words. However, the young man repeated that he meant the final resting place of the mysterious maiden, a martial arts master who ruled the world hundreds of years ago and was buried roughly in this place. Of course, the man wanted to know how the hero came to know about this. However, in his past life, the man himself boasted before him about the treasures he had found. The head of the society perfectly understood that surely the Lord Manager, that is Jin Emyun in the past, had never encountered such valuables, and he boasted that he had found these relics with an extremely rich history. Since then, Jin Emyun swore to himself that the man would not get a penny of that money. The young man assumed that the excavations were still not finished. The problem might have been that the head had not deciphered the map. As is known, in the past life, the Society of Seekers of Enlightenment possessed unparalleled authority. Even Jin Emyun, the one who managed the affairs of the inner court, had to personally serve this lord. And then that arrogant one boasted that thanks to the martial arts technique, which was a treasure obtained in the tomb of the heavenly maiden, their society had risen on the wings of success. Of course, Jin Emyun was clearly angered by the fact that those scoundrels had plundered the sacred tomb without even deigning to report to the cult. However, they only learned about this outrageous crime 10 years later. It was already impossible to hold the guilty accountable. Moreover, the greatest villainy committed by the society was their behavior at a critical moment. When those scoundrels found out that the heavenly demonic cult was on the brink of collapse, they simply packed up and decided to join orthodox or unorthodox sects. This the hero could not forgive in any way. Therefore, the young man calmly explained to the man that the clan had preserved records about the tomb of the mysterious Maiden of Heaven, and the heir had a proposal. As the eldest scion of the clan, he wished to cooperate with the head of the society himself. They could combine efforts in excavating the tomb. Of course, they could also hire commoners who would activate the protective mechanisms inside the tomb on their behalf. Everything found would be divided equally. Naturally, the man was immensely happy to hear about a 50-50 split. He assumed that Jin Emyun would want to appropriate practically all the treasures. However, for the heir of one of the 6 great clans, the young man was surprisingly generous. However, it turned out that the hero simply wanted to ask the man for one favor in return. The young man demanded nothing special. He had only heard that the earth-listening technique of the Society of Enlightenment Seekers was unparalleled in this world. Obviously, the leader thought that the hero wanted him to follow someone, which was a quite logical assumption. Somewhere around the same time, the liaison was tending to his horse, resenting the fact that the third, who hadn't even properly handled a simple murder, somehow ranked higher than himself in the hierarchy. However, for the sake of the grand plan, he was ready to endure even such humiliation. However, the third was extremely curious whether he would be given the position of the second if he managed to obtain the Jade Sword. But the reporter considered this completely impossible. Moreover, he asked the third not to let personal ambitions interfere with the grand plan, since it could sweep him away along with everyone else. Obviously, judging by these words, the third concluded that the second's position was not so stable. And although the first was an unmatched genius who could not be outdone, he could easily defeat the second. Therefore, the young man very much hoped that the reporter would not be too offended if he took some of the glory for himself. After all, from the reporter's point of view, it should not have mattered so much who exactly completed the mission, as long as it was accomplished. And the liaison could not deny. With such a development of events, another failure could not be allowed. Therefore, he decided to send a report to the Lord of the 8 Heavens just in case, since the current chaos could in no way interfere with his revenge. At that very moment, the chief instructor approached the liaison to find out how many horses they had for sale. The woman apologized for forgetting the instructor's order. She had too many other customers. She also decided to find out if the instructor had finished his duties. And he was indignant, all because of that heir Jin Emyun. Just because he once used his name, the young man turned him into a lackey. In the end, the instructor let him off because the young man at least paid for the assignment, and even allowed him to keep the change, and the instructor quite liked money. However, before finishing the deal, the girl suggested to the man to have a couple of shots of alcohol, and then they could return and finish their business. Somewhere around the same time, the head of the society finally provided the hero with the full accounting of the Society of Seekers of Enlightenment, as he had requested. However, he warned. He showed her to Jin Emyun exclusively because the young man was the eldest son of one of the 6 great clans. The man had no idea why the young man needed this, but wanted to know about all the pitfalls in advance, although the boss was sure that some spoiled buddy and daddy's boy understood nothing about it. However, the hero was shocked by the figures. There were massive embezzlements everywhere, concealments with classified reporting. All this money apparently went to the excavation of the tomb. As he thought, 50-50 was already too generous toward society, and these scoundrels deserved at most 10-90 in his favor. The hero did not care at all about his promise. He always followed the path of the demon. This was no longer petty revenge for the fact that this gentleman tried to play on his nerves with a silly smile. In the end, the young man calmly explained to the man that their profitability was too low and needed to be significantly increased. However, the heir could not leave the accounting department in such chaos, so he suggested to the head to take a walk, or it would be better to see everything with his own eyes. Soon they went out into the city to take a little walk. However, at the same time, the leader immediately realized that the nearest point on the Silk Road was about 400 li away from here. The problem was that no one would buy expensive imported silk in a backwater province like this. Moreover, the patterns of the white tree and happy flowers were shocking. Although they were not bad, they were already out of fashion, and the colors had faded. The leader thought that the hero was hinting at selling the goods in Xinan. However, the tyrannical heavens controlled that market. They would not be able to sell anything even if they wanted to. Besides, according to the records, silk was last sold a whole week ago, and the man listened to the hero simply because he hoped to establish a connection with the Jin clan, a vain hope that a few crumbs would fall from the master's table to help their floating finances. However, the hero began to reason that it was necessary to better stock up on durable and long-lasting fabrics that would be useful to travelers, Thus, the young man went through each sales point and commented on the goods. But in the end, wherever you looked, the entire sales system was initially broken. Everyone did their own thing without thinking about the consequences. The heir believed that in such cases the only thing to do was to crush the competition with capital. And honestly, listening to the conversation from the side, Lady Beck even thought that in a past life the young man had been a merchant. For this reason, the next day she ran up to him with a question about yesterday's conversation, about using capital and building a new sales network. And it turned out that the young man got the money for this precisely after their agreement. She was quite angry when she thought that the hero had taken all the wealth for himself. However, the young man suggested calling it a military budget, although Beck-san was indignant, believing that this money should have gone to other matters. Only then did she remember that she herself had signed the document, so this money no longer belonged to her. And the hero calmed the girl, deciding to move on to more important matters. After all, as is known, the only consistently profitable establishment of the society was the tea house of the lunar ocean where they were now heading. It was precisely from this moment that they intended to eradicate every scoundrel from the tyrannical heavens. However, suddenly 3 frightened little snakes ran up to the gentleman. They immediately began pointing towards the entrance of the building, but could not explain anything clearly, so they suggested the gentleman find out everything himself. Obviously, the hero first thought that perhaps the tyrannical heavens had done something wrong. When he went inside, he saw the terrified head of the society, who behaved exactly like his assistants. However, the young man basically behaved the same way when he saw the people sitting at the table. The woman calmly noted that the hero was very late. But Chajin Amyun was extremely curious about how these two had ended up in such distant lands at all. Not long before this, the heavenly demon Jong Taejeon was teaching his daughter, explaining that enemies must not be underestimated. They were preparing to swap the heavens with the basest places of the world. And of course, the girl was curious to know what would happen if they succeeded. Then the man mentioned the classic tales of mountains and seas. And although Chong Yura did not like such old legends, she had heard quite a lot about them. The tales of mountains and seas were written in ancient times and told of various sacred beasts and monsters from legends. And these people were descendants of that very era of legends, and their only desire was to fold the heavens and turn the world back to those ancient mythical times. However, at the moment their blood was so weakened that apart from their potential, they were no different from ordinary people. Of course, the lady from the SA family was extremely curious why these people were so eager for their vision of the world. And Chong Taejeon did not know the exact answer. After all, he had heard about it exclusively from records. What is known? In the era of sacred beasts and monsters, the heavens and the earth were filled with spiritual energy, and people reached the heavens, unlimited in their talent. However, this literally meant limitless improvement of martial arts. Not at all like something terrible. However, Chong Taejeon suggested the girl think about how many people would survive in such an era. Limitlessly powerful sacred creatures and monsters against a limitlessly powerful human. Only extremely outstanding individuals would survive, the rest would simply be exterminated. Well, there was nothing to worry about. As long as Jeon Taejong was alive, those scoundrels would not dare show themselves. Of course, many were enticed by the sweet words of those little people. But that was not such a big problem. All that needed to be done was to crush the bugs that crawled out, that's all. The heiress, however, became interested in whether anyone else in the world of martial arts knew the true nature of these people. And the very reason why the head of the alliance entrusted his granddaughter to the cult was that only on this issue did the orthodox and unorthodox sects set aside their differences. Therefore, the head of the alliance entrusted his granddaughter to them, and now she, together with the son of the Jin clan, took up the leadership of their group. Of course, Jeon Yuru was embarrassed by such joyful news, and her father asked her to calm down. However, the daughter, burning with anger, pretended to be extremely calm. Understanding that the daughter's temper could not be pacified, the man suggested that the girl visit the hero herself and take the right guardian with her if she was so worried about the guy. He would lift the punishment from her. Because besides waving the blade all day long, it was also important to rest periodically to clear the mind. In the end, for the lady, these were real holidays, so she hurriedly tied her hair, ready for the journey. After all, the heavenly demon agreed to give his daughter time to rest, since the pavilion of the primordial waters needed repairs after her training. However, he asked that during her short break she not cause any trouble. At that time, the man did not yet know that the holidays he granted his daughter would not pass peacefully, as was expected from the very beginning. Immediately, the maid explained to the hero that their strong heiress was allowed a vacation, so they came here to enjoy tea at an establishment with an excellent reputation. And honestly, the events when the heiress was on vacation were quite an unusual sight. In the end, they invited the hero to the table and wanted to find out how his affairs were going. And finally, over a cup of tea, the young man revealed that he planned to enter negotiations with the subsidiary branches of the 9 Heavenly Immortals sect. Of course, the head of the society was excited by such secret news, not expecting the gentleman to negotiate with the orthodox sect. However, he reminded the well-known principle, keep your friends close and your enemies closer. Naturally, the head of the society was worried. After all, these little people would not even let them say a word. He had heard that in orthodox sects, the heavenly demonic cult was not tolerated. For them, dirty unorthodox sects were better than the demonic cult. However, ignoring the words of the head, the hero appeared at the negotiations. There, the young man introduced himself as the heir of the heavenly demonic clan, and came to meet the head of the 9 heavenly immortals sect. After that, he invited the young man to the table, explaining that soon the first disciple of the head of the tyrannical heavens, the Golden Lord of Ghosts, would also come to them. Jin Emyun smiled and said that he had heard about the merits of the tyrannical heavens, who broke into the market using their endless resources, which caused many problems for the others. And the man himself was indignant at those cursed dogs, not understanding why they needed this backwater town at all. He tried to buy their shops, which they had built, even for a large sum of money, but the scoundrels refused. Therefore, the man was indignant that these people did not know how to conduct business at all. However, the hero understood. In order to subdue these little people, it was necessary to satisfy his 3 conditions: consent, justification, and practicality. Of course, the man also noticed that the picture of the divine cult of the heavenly demon and the orthodox sect, united in the name of the struggle against the tyrannical heavens, did not look very impressive. It was precisely for this reason, to prevent this, that they awaited one representative. After all, as is known, when 2 factions shake hands, an alliance is formed. However, with the third, it was already a compromise. Therefore, the Golden Lord of Ghosts appeared. The others could not believe they saw him in person. After all, the man looked like a very manly person. He himself thanked for the invitation, but admitted that he did not expect the meeting place to be the walls of the Orthodox section. The hero was grateful for the response to the invitation, and introduced himself as Jin Emyun from the great Jin clan. And the man had heard of the hero. After all, rumors of the new demonic dragon had spread from afar. Of course, Jin Emyun was surprised that he was called the demonic dragon. This meant that the man knew all the latest affairs, including events related to his younger brother. It also indicated that the tyrannical heavens had very excellent information-gathering abilities. Of course, the head of the society was extremely interested in when the gentleman managed to contact the tyrannical heavens. However, the young man explained that he had sent the instructor to Xi'an a couple of days ago with one task. And recalling the day the message arrived, the man admitted that he was quite amazed by the fact that the young heir of the divine cult of the heavenly demon used a secret method of contact known to a select few. However, the hero was no less surprised that the Golden Lord of Ghosts unexpectedly called him the new demonic dragon. After that, the 2 exchanged glances before the man finally calmed down, not asking unnecessary questions about the source of the young man's information. After which he reminded that at the moment it was necessary to solve the problem of the misconduct of the youngest of their disciples. However, the hero noted, when they talked about the youngest's violations, they downplayed the misdeeds of the other disciples, pretending that they were not involved. But it turned out that the man had thoroughly investigated the interference of the rest of the youth. However, this issue exclusively concerned the impulsiveness of the youngest. Moreover, he himself did not want the Central Plains to be subjected to the abyss of chaos because of some tomb. He did not care what was buried in that tomb. He wanted the kids to sort things out among themselves. The Orthodox trio had no idea which tomb was being referred to, and the head of the society panicked. How did the man know about their secrets? The hero quickly realized. The Golden Lord of Ghosts had 2 requests for them. The first was to keep this meeting secret, and the second, it seemed, was related to the life of the youngest of the disciples. However, the old man calmly explained that no matter what foolishness the boy committed, he was still part of the tyrannical heavens. However, the old man wished that everyone who persuaded the boy to abandon his path would be sentenced to death. However, Jin Emyun noted, if the youngest disciple were to meet a tragic end by unfortunate circumstances, they would be powerless to do anything. The Golden Lord smiled, understanding the essence of what was said. After all, no one is insured against death. Watching their rather passive-aggressive negotiations, the members of the Orthodox side had no idea where this would lead, but they could not support such passions involving possible murder. However, the hero hastened to calm the trio. After all, when 3 parties join hands, it is called a compromise. They no longer dealt with who was orthodox, who was unorthodox, or who belonged to the demonic cult. They negotiated for the common good. And honestly, the Golden Lord was surprised that it was so easy to find common ground with the eldest son of the Jin clan. These feelings were mutual, for the young man finally began to understand why the man was the first disciple of the Lord of all evils. During their negotiations, the Orthodox simply remained silent, understanding why these 2 were constantly compared to each other, for they were equally passive-aggressive. Next, the conversation turned to the very Maiden of the Heavens, whose tomb had been found. This maiden was a wanderer who appeared almost out of thin air hundreds of years ago, and proved herself an incomparable master of martial arts. Both in ancient and recent times, she swept through the Central Plains like a bloody storm. At that time, even the great sect of the 9 heavenly immortals was close to the brink of extinction, so it was believed that perhaps its martial arts and relics were preserved in the tomb, so the discussion was no longer about some million or even 2 million liang. However, as was said, they could not control everything they found as they were supposed to. And so, the Orthodox were planning secretly to divide all the loot, just to earn a bit more money. Finally, the Golden Lord realized that the issue had basically been resolved and was already about to leave. And the hero once again expressed gratitude for the generous concessions from the man. However, he considered it an appropriate tribute for agreeing to correct the younger one's bad habits. Both hoped that their next meeting would take place under more pleasant circumstances. And the heir could not but agree with these words, considering that both the tyrannical heavens and the demonic cult had a common enemy, the Orthodox faction. In the end, the man finally left the city walls, heading home. However, he could not forget that the girl had alerted his feelings. Even though the eldest son of the Jin clan was shining brightly like a wolf with huge fangs, the girl he noticed in the corner was like a tigress hiding her claws. Therefore, he urged the horses, ordering the servants to compile a list of all known female masters in the divine cult of the heavenly demon. She is at least at the peak level of perfection. The hero could finally act calmly, without worrying about the tyrannical heavens. Moreover, he generously paid the Society of Enlightenment Seekers for their favor, so that his conscience would not torment him. The head of the society himself was glad that he could now seize the treasures of the Virgin of the Heavens for his own hands. However, unexpectedly, stopping, the young man reminded the head of his request. The request was to transfer their great technique to the subordinates of Jin Emyun, and everything was already ready, so they could start transferring the technique as early as tomorrow. As is known, the secret technique of the Society of Enlightenment Seekers, which even the divine cult of the heavenly demon coveted, was a method of purifying demonic energy inside the body. In a way, it resembled body purification, but it did not block the meridians. The head of the society did not even suspect how the 3 guys had earned the favor that Jin Emyun showed. However, the young man simply intended to use them as his workforce until death. Therefore, after these words, the man stopped envying the trio, preferring simply to pray for their restless souls. The next day, the hero tried the new technique. It effectively purified his internal energy and could buy him time until he mastered the Tyrant Lord's method. From this day, truly important matters began for the heir. However, unexpectedly, when the young man was about to enter the estate grounds, he heard strange conversations. Young Yura was very indignant at Baek-san, who had dragged Jin Emyun into those disputes. At the same time, Lady Baek did not understand why some girl was interfering in their affairs at all. After all, the hero was neither her right hand nor even a close person. Young Yura was already about to engage in a fight with this annoying girl, but fortunately, her maid stopped her, begging the lady not to cause a commotion here. Honestly, Jin Emyun had no idea what was happening. Meanwhile, Baek-san realized that these 2 girls belonged to the SA clan, so Baek-san concluded that Young Yura was the direct heir of Black Gold. Only this explained why the girl considered the heir Jin her equal. But finally the hero joined them, wishing that the 3 would explain the performance they had arranged. However, Baek-san calmly explained that she was simply walking to the meeting place, after which she smiled and suggested to the young man that they go together since they had already crossed paths so successfully. Before leaving, the heir warned Baek-san, although he appreciated her help, the young lady needed to remember the circumstances and be extremely cautious. For this reason, the young man asked that the girl stay constantly by his side. However, unexpectedly, Jong Yura, who was following behind, declared that she also wanted to help the hero. After all, he himself had spoken about dangerous circumstances. Of course, the young man tried to explain to the lady that it would be too risky to ask her for such services. This clearly annoyed the girl. She could not believe that the hero did not need her help. However, he hastened to explain. He was not refusing her help. It was just that she could not assist because it would be too dangerous, and her own life could be at stake. Especially considering that if the cult leader found out that his daughter was involved in such work, the man would surely simply execute him. And honestly, Jong Yura was angered by these words. It seemed that the hero was humiliating her, thinking that she was less capable than that clumsy girl who would put him in danger. Naturally, Jin Emyun immediately began to deny this, making it clear that Jong Yura had misunderstood him and literally begged for help, because he did not know how to calm the girl. At this time, the events shifted to the Moon Ocean Tea House, where guests were arriving, talking about their clans of the valley and the Green Forest, as well as about worldly affairs. And then a new waitress brought hot tea to one of the arriving visitors, and the man simply froze, not knowing what to say, due to the striking appearance of the waitress. Obviously, John Yura thought she might have made a mistake with the order, and that the tea was not ordered by this man. However, under her attentive gaze, he hurriedly swallowed all the poured tea. And the others, admiring the beauty, had no idea who she was, so they assumed that perhaps she was the next daughter-in-law of the head of the society. At that moment, another new waitress came to serve their table, bringing them fragrant and warm teas. And before leaving, she smiled and asked to be called if anything else was needed. In the end, the men had no idea what had happened today in the lunar ocean. Today, there were just too many beauties here. Moreover, what was most surprising, even here Baek-san competed with the lady to see who would sell more cups during the shift. At that very moment, their attention was drawn by shouts from above. There sat the lady from the Sae clan who made magical predictions about where it was better to direct the merchant's sales. She suggested to one of them to go to Sichuan, because there he would sell the jade of the Lunar Valley at 3 times the price for making secret weapons. Of course, everyone truly considered this girl the queen of merchants. One worried about how to deliver the goods to Beijing, but now he had nothing to worry about. Everyone was eager for her to answer their questions, and considering that her information was so accurate, the visitors were insanely happy with the money spent. They immediately began showering the girl with gold and expensive drinks, believing that the brilliant lady deserved the very best, reporting that her business acumen was as sharp as her taste in the finest things. The hero watched all this from afar, amazed that the number of visitors had tripled in just 3 days. Moreover, most of the guests were merchants. Therefore, it is no coincidence that the Black Gold clan is considered literally the dominant trade clan. At that very moment, the frightened head of the society crept up to the hero. He knew that the young man was an incredible person, but he was worried whether it was right to use the young heiress like that, and whether they would be punished for it. No matter how the hero tried to calm him, the man believed he would die the most terrible death at the hands of her father, the heavenly demon John Taejong. Moreover, he wanted to know how much longer they would have to do this. After all, he could no longer bear it. However, this time the chief did not manage to answer the hero before guests appeared who looked like real bandits. Obviously, the assistant immediately ran to the head of the society, reporting the arrival of people from the Black Tiger sect. However, for some reason, upon their arrival, the man was only glad, because now finally the exploitation of the heiress would end. Shortly before that, the thugs learned that the tea house had gathered a whole crowd. People say very beautiful girls appeared there, which was hard to imagine. However, the head of the sect became extremely curious about what kind of beautiful ladies could be in the tea house run by the Society of Seekers of Enlightenment. However, he still understood that the head of the society should not be underestimated. Perhaps he really had invented something new for his business. The assistant reported that there were 3 beauties of unearthly beauty there, and such as, if you look for them, you won't find in any other city. In the end, the man was already quite excited by his ideas, so he decided to check this report. At least he could briefly visit as a guest. Moreover, behind him stood the tyrannical heavens themselves. After all, as visitors, they had the right to be outraged by poor and inappropriate service. And if the Black Tiger sect also destroys the tea house of the Lunar Ocean, then with one shot they will kill 2 birds. Obviously, everyone tensed up immediately when the worst scoundrels barged into the establishment. However, the leader immediately ordered that he be allowed to look at the 3 beauties who had been brought here. Right after that, he grabbed one of the guests by the collar, demanding that he immediately show him those very beauties, and the guest could only beg for mercy. But finally, Chong Yura came down from the upper floor, not understanding what the commotion was about. And indeed, seeing her, the man understood why this beauty was considered worthy to be called an incomparable flower. At the same time, the girl had a stern look. However, for Jin Emyun, the man's comments remained incomprehensible. To him, the young heiress was rather light and lovely, like a breath of fragrant chrysanthemums. The girl immediately noticed what the bandit was fixing after the commotion, and guessed that he was not a guest. However, this scoundrel hastened to throw the beaten man away, after which he kindly inquired the name of the lovely lady. However, Chon Yura discontentedly made it clear that this man did not deserve to know her name, and he was surprised that she rejected him outright. Daring to humiliate him like that, he also prepared to hit her to finish off the foolish girl. Obviously, all the visitors immediately rebelled and wanted to stand up for the young lady. But to their surprise, she herself easily avoided the inevitable blow. After that, the girl pushed the man with such force that he crashed into the table, destroying it with the mass of his body. And everyone simply froze, for they did not guess that the young lady possessed such strength. At that moment, the hero, watching the man, realized that this was the very leader of the infamous Black Tiger sect. However, the young man had no idea why such a person had come to their tea house at all. However, he pretended as if the man whispered in his ear that his goal was to seize their establishment. Of course, the beaten assistant could not believe that the captain said such a thing, and tried to explain that it was a misunderstanding. However, the evil gaze of Chong Yura was already aimed at him. At that very moment, the leader announced that the Society of Seekers of Enlightenment demands full compensation from the Black Tiger sect. For the damage caused to the tea house of the Moon Ocean in their city Haiden, they must compensate. And only then did everyone realize these guys had fallen into a trap they themselves had used until now. Of course, the bandits tried to escape from this trap, while the other townspeople praised the wise act of the Society of Seekers of Enlightenment. However, 3 snakes blocked the bandits' exit, making it clear that they would not go anywhere. They wanted to finally have some fun. After all, they had already gotten bored during endless training sessions. and the hero calmly explained to the present townspeople that he would need their testimonies in order to demand compensation according to all the rules. And everyone immediately lined up, because they wanted to make sure the world heard about the lawlessness they witnessed. After all, they saw how these villains caused a riot here. They also began to complain that the bandits threatened their lives and also mistreated the waitress girls. However, suddenly a bandit shouted, realizing that Jin Emyun did not know who exactly stood behind them. In the end, while fleeing, he swore that they would definitely take revenge for how they were treated. The chapter, of course, was worried that they let those two escape. However, the hero knew the Orthodox sects would handle the rest of the disputes. They would have been better off focusing on their own problems. For example, the problem was the young man's last request, and the man immediately took out the cherished yellow sheet with inscriptions on it. It turned out to be a special spell sheet. They could track any person. For example, they found out that the second was talking to the instructor. Unfortunately, they could not eavesdrop. Well, nevertheless, by this sheet it was possible to track his location and immediately learn about his movements. When the hero saw the red-haired girl together with the second, he immediately realized that the suspicions about this guy were correct. He will definitely begin actions precisely in Haidun. At this time, the third was informed that the Black Tiger sect had disbanded, and the unorthodox sects are now pursuing its leaders in the city of Haidun. Obviously, the second wanted to know what had happened to their group. Their own territory was already being seized by the enemy. They could not simply sit and watch idly. They had to immediately advance their group to fix the situation. But it turned out that the first disciple was firmly against using their powers. And of course, the third was surprised that the elder brother decided to treat him that way. Therefore, he ordered that the others convey his words. The second must immediately finish off the granddaughter of the alliance leader. The third himself would take full responsibility. The main thing was to deal with her. However, it turned out that the messenger overheard all this, and was convinced that neither the second nor the third were equal to the first. The girl came because she had to tell him something. The Lord of the Eight Heavens was heading here. And of course, the young man was quite frightened by such a report from the otherworldly raven. As is known, the right to gaze upon the Sichjo fortress from the highest vantage point belongs only to the orthodox leader of the tyrannical heavens. Finally, the Golden Lord arrived at his master, immediately bowing. He explained that he came to beg forgiveness for interfering in the affairs of the younger one in Haidun. And the master had already heard about all this. He had formed an alliance with the orthodox sect and the demonic cult. However, the matter was not specifically that the man wanted to apologize. He showed treachery by trying to use this incident as a pretext to exclude the younger one. However, without answering, the master decided to find out. Does the man remember that Cho Yu was his uncle, as well as one of the founders of the tyrannical heavens? When the master of the Golden Lord began the formation of the tyrannical heavens, Cho Yu helped him by securing funding from the trading guild of the Paik clan. As is known, the Paik clan managed the best among the 5 great trading companies, known as the greatest in the world. The Paik clan basically did not object to their cooperation. They invested practically immeasurable capital without demanding its return, but constantly found ingenious solutions to any problems that arose. It was on faith and trust that Cho Yu entrusted his friend to look after his descendants. The younger one was actually his child. But due to his financial security, as well as the growth of the Paik clan, he and Cho Yu spent more than 10 years building the tyrannical heavens. Therefore, the friend himself had a question. When did he manage to escape and have a child? It always seemed strange to him. But now, after thinking carefully, the master realized the situation was even ironic. If Cho Yu and his old comrades had not pushed him to create a new organization, the tyrannical heavens would hardly have existed. Moreover, the master was already old. His aspirations, like his ambitions, had long dried up. From now on, it was the responsibility of his followers. Since he decided to act, he had to act decisively. He must not allow the tyrannical heavens, to the construction of which he devoted his entire life, to fall by an unworthy hand. He trusted him with the heavenly squad and wanted to understand what his disciple had achieved. Of course, the man was delighted. After all, the heavenly squad could literally be compared to tens of thousands of warriors whom he had received into his personal command. Somewhere at the same time at night, Baek-san ran to the instructor, not understanding why he had called her. However, she met only a red-haired lady who offered her to share a decent drink. Unfortunately, by the time the girl arrived, almost nothing was left because the mentor had gotten very drunk. After which, as if nothing had happened, she decided to ask Baek-san whether she liked this city Haidun. There was delicious food and alcohol here. Moreover, there was plenty of such tasty alcohol. And indeed, having tried it, Baek-san was convinced that it had a very soft and still sweet taste. Besides, the aroma of familiar flowers. The red-haired girl explained that it was wine made from Manhwa flowers, popular in the surroundings. The girl should have recognized it. After that, the Midnight Raven called her by name. Sword Flower of the Southern Lotus Baek-san. Jumping back, the beauty realized that it was a trap for her. Moreover, judging by how her energy was scattered to the sides, The offered drink contained an energy-dispersing poison mixed with various suppressive toxins. The Midnight Raven herself explained, "If Baek-san calmly gives them the jade sword, they will spare her life." Of course, the girl panicked, not understanding who these people were, especially the instructor, who drank the drink with her but was fine, as if he had resistance to poisons. The girl herself calmly introduced herself with a smile. "The greatest organization of hired assassins on this continent, the Assassins of the Storm." Moreover, she was quite indignant that Baek-san did not die from the poison of the Hall of 1001 Nights. After all, that would have been much simpler. But she decided to complicate everything. For this reason, the instructor ordered her fighters to immediately remove Baek-san so that no trace of it remained. However, the girl maliciously reminded that she would not allow anyone to kill her so easily. However, deep down she quite hoped for the help of the young master Jin Emyun. Well, at that moment Gu-chil ran to her defense. Honestly, he was impressed that Baek-san resisted poisoning for so long. After that, he calmly asked her to step aside and not to worry about anything. Still, her savior arrived. Mr. Jin personally sent Gu-chil to help her. However, Gu-chil quickly recognized the ghost of 9 Clouds and was surprised. After all, she was supposed to die back in the times of the city's cleansing. But distracting them from the conversation, Baek-san noticed another attacker. It was the second, which was specifically aimed at Baek-san and was flying towards her. However, Gu-chil interfered with the fighter and timely protected the lady with his blade. In fact, this guy was one of the targets that her master had previously ordered her to watch. He was truly worth it. After all, he was strong. Panicking, the instructor immediately ordered her fighters not to lose vigilance with the man they saw before them. After all, he had once survived a great purge and was famous even among demonic phantom assassins and was quite strong. But honestly, Gu-chil could not believe that his old acquaintance had seriously betrayed the divine cult. However, the girl was surprised that Gu-chil still could not understand this, since the reason for her betrayal was already obvious to everyone else. However, Gu-chil did not want to hear any explanations for the betrayal, so he attacked his old acquaintance, asking her simply not to tell him any excuses or lies. And from this battle of masters, honestly, the other assassins were in shock. They could not even approach the combatants. Gu-chil realized, as expected, his old friend had not rusted at all. However, he could not see her countless threads, which she had been so proud of before. Well, the girl calmly reminded, this will be a real massacre if she takes out those threads. This is not a weapon that can be used to protect someone's life. But at that moment, drawing the main enemy's attention to herself, the girl immediately ordered the second to attack. At that moment, he created the energy of fire in his right palm and the energy of water in his left. It was the demonic art of destroying the sun and the moon. However, only one person in the divine cult possessed such techniques. Therefore, to be honest, Gu-chil had no idea how deep the problem had gone. In the end, sufficiently distracting the opponents in battle, Gu-chil looked up, asking for support, and the heiress only thanked the man for his help. Everything she had seen was enough for her to understand everything. Immediately after that, she spread her black threads, each of which was infused with sword energy. It was a divine technique, impossible without reaching the peak of perfection. After the attack, Jeon-yura, together with her maid, as if nothing had happened, descended from the roof of the building to the enemies near the injured Baek-san. Obviously, everyone was quite surprised to see the young heiress. However, the second stepped forward, greeting the young lady. He introduced himself as the heir of the 7th Elder, as well as an outstanding student of the Hall of 1001 Nights. The young man explained that he was very eager to take the place of the lord of the demonic faction of the divine cult. And of course, everyone was amazed at how this audacious fellow spoke just now. Even the Midnight Raven was, to put it mildly, shocked after his words. However, he claimed that he had long dreamed of becoming a partner for Chun-yura. Although he was sorry that their meeting took place under such circumstances, he was determined to prove to the girl his extraordinary value. At the very least, he could show her that he was a man worthy of standing beside her. And honestly, hearing these words, the assistant from the SA clan instantly remembered a hero who had declared something similar. She recalled his gaze, full of burning determination, directed exclusively at her mistress. And so now the heiress knew for sure. The young man's gaze was not directed at her at all, but at someone else. Therefore, she wished for him to go and resolve his problems with the one involved in that gaze. After all, the girl refused to be used by outsiders in their dirty affairs. And honestly, the second was surprised that the heiress so quickly guessed his desire to surpass the first. Well, even if she refused him, he still wanted to be near her. Fortunately for the naive guy, the Midnight Raven managed to drag him away, because the heiress had already sent after them an attack of the demon sword art, cleaving the heavens. In the end, the operation was completely failed, so everyone retreated towards the tomb. Of course, the assistant did not understand whether it was the right decision to simply scare them away like that. However, Jeon-yura understood. If they wanted to completely destroy them according to Jin Emyun's plan, letting them go now was the right decision. And honestly, the assistant was amazed at how much the lady had changed. Her habits, character, dry tone, and even the manner of conversation, everything was different. Soon, the head of the society arrived at the noise, who was in despair upon seeing the destroyed tea house. At the same time, the cult heiress was glad that their operation had passed without human casualties. The head had no choice but to swallow his tears when he suddenly noticed that several disciples of the Hall of 1001 had escaped after the operation failed. It became obvious that the escapees were spies, and the hero decided to find out if there was a large-built man among the escapees. The conversation turned to Sandoshan, and of course, John Yura became interested in why the young man was interested in this warrior. However, the reason was that the hero wanted to make him his subordinate. However, Baek-san was sure. Sandoshan was surely being blackmailed. He once told her that he wanted to protect someone. Well, as Baek-san thought, this meant that someone close to him was being held hostage. And indeed, if the guy was pressured, when everything fell into place, among other things, even someone like the Seventh Elder would not be difficult to suppress with the power of his clan. It would be very useful to lure Sandoshan to their side. However, at that moment, Gu-chil looked anxiously into the gentleman's eyes, implicitly asking him to step aside for a private conversation. The guy immediately understood that he probably wanted to say something personal. As it turned out, Gu-chil asked the gentleman to save one person. It was a comrade from the former squad of phantom assassins who survived that cleansing incident. Soon, those gathered around the tomb reported that they ultimately failed the mission and fled like beaten mongrels. Moreover, what was most disappointing was that the second displayed the martial arts of the Lord of the Eight Heavens to the others. The second clearly did not understand that he had ruined their great plan. However, he believed they would have a chance to succeed, and such a chance existed only if they went and wiped out all of Haidun before dawn. Then no witnesses would remain. Well, the second admitted that all he needed was the recognition of the young heiress of the cult. Therefore, he tried to understand which gaze the young lady was referring to. No matter how many options he considered, it could only be Jin Yamyung, the eldest son of the Jin clan. They must have exchanged messages, which perfectly explained the appearance of the young heiress in Haidun. Consequently, the young man needed to personally settle accounts with Jin Yamyung in order to finally complete his legendary plan. After that, the second turned to Sandoshan, giving him the task of killing the girl from the Baek clan. They all, except the third, staged their deaths in the tomb, and only Sandoshan will be allowed to return to the cult. In other words, he had to finish off Baek-san, and then he could live peacefully, helping his clan. This literally left him with a choice between Baek-san from the Hall of 1001 Nights, whom he had only recently grown close to, or the clan that had accepted him since childhood. However, unexpectedly, unorthodox scoundrels ran out to meet this group. While they were approaching, Sandoshan himself recalled his story. He was an orphan, and one day he got caught in a wild boar trap, and of course, people were surprised that the caught one was a human child, resembling a bear cub. In the end, he was taken in by the San clan. They were quite surprised to have picked up such a hungry child. He devoured meat with both cheeks and was somewhat like a mountain bandit. For this reason, the woman who found him suggested giving him the name Sandochok, which literally translated as mountain bandit. Only the man understood. Although their family engaged in banditry, it was still an inappropriate name for a child, so they chose the name Sandoshon. After that, everyone took on the task of raising the child. However, at first, he committed real banditry. Everyone was surprised at how much strength the boy had even without cultivating internal energy. Fortunately, they were lucky to find him while he was still a child. In the end, only thanks to the tireless efforts of these people was Sandoshan able to start living the life of a worthy person. When he grew up, he constantly tried to help his family, and even when going for a run, he tried to bring food for them. And of course, the people who became parents were very proud of him, and so they lived, modestly but happily. But suddenly people stormed into their home. These scoundrels considered their house the perfect place to hide from pursuers and plan their next moves. The person who came to them was the monster from the demon cave himself, and his appearance terrified the San family.